Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of axes, ashes, and silence. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages, but not for the people you've heard about. Not the knights or the peasants or the plague doctors. Tonight we're talking about the plants, the forests, the fields, the quiet, rooted things that couldn't run when the fires came or scream when the axes fell. Forget the romanticized version of medieval Europe. The truth is, if you were a plant between the 5th and 15th centuries, you probably didn't survive. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just sprouted as an oak seedling in the year 1300. The good news is, you're alive. The bad news is, your forest is about to disappear. For the next 1,000 years, you and every other photosynthesizing organism in Europe are about to experience one of the longest, slowest ecological disasters in human history. And no one's going to write it down. No one's going to mourn you. Because you're just a plant. And plants, in the medieval mind, existed for one reason only: to be used. Europe was once covered in forest, dense, ancient, unbroken wilderness, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains. Oak, beech, ash, and elm towered over mossy floors where ferns unfurled in the shadows and mushrooms sprouted in silence. These weren't the tidy parks we know today. These were primeval ecosystems, alive with biodiversity, humming with insects, birds, mammals, and countless plant species that had evolved over millennia in relative balance. But by the time the Middle Ages began, that balance was already tipping. The Roman Empire had cleared vast tracts of land for agriculture and roads. When it collapsed in the 5th century, Europe fragmented into kingdoms, fiefdoms, and scattered settlements. And as populations slowly recovered and began to grow again, so did the hunger for land. More people meant more mouths to feed. More mouths meant more fields, and more fields meant one thing: the forests had to go. Deforestation in medieval Europe wasn't a sudden event. It was a creeping, relentless process that lasted centuries. Village by village, acre by acre, the woodlands were hacked down. Peasants cleared land with hand axes. Monks drained wetlands and felled trees to build monasteries. Lords granted permission to clear forest in exchange for loyalty or rent. It was systematic, socially sanctioned, and utterly unsustainable. By the 13th century, much of England, France, and Germany had lost more than half of their original forest cover. In some regions, it was worse. Ancient groves that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to stumps and ash in a single generation. And here's the thing: no one replanted. The concept of reforestation didn't exist. Trees were seen as obstacles, not resources, to be managed. Once they were gone, they were simply gone. And it wasn't just about farmland. Every part of medieval life demanded wood. Homes were built from timber. Fences were made from split logs. Barrels, carts, ploughs, handles, everything required wood. Firewood was the only source of heat and cooking fuel for millions of people. A single household could burn through several cords of wood each winter. Multiply that by every village, every town, every cold season, and you begin to understand the scale of consumption. Then, there was charcoal. To produce iron, you needed charcoal. To make charcoal, you needed to slowly burn massive amounts of wood in low oxygen pits. It took roughly 10 units of wood to produce 1 unit of charcoal. Blacksmiths, armorers, and toolmakers depended on it. So did warfare. Swords, horseshoes, nails, chains, all required charcoal. And so the forests burned, not in wild flames, but in controlled, smouldering mounds that consumed entire groves. The trees that survived weren't safe either. They were coppiced, a technique where you cut a tree down to a stump and let it regrow from the base, producing multiple thin trunks instead of one thick one. It was medieval forest management, and it worked to some degree, but it also meant that forests never matured, old growth disappeared. Ancient trees, the kind that live for centuries and support entire ecosystems, vanished. What remained were scrubby, fast-growing stands that lacked the complexity and resilience of true wilderness. And with the forests gone, so went everything that depended on them. Birds lost nesting sites, mammals lost shelter, fungi lost their symbiotic partners. Understory plants, the ferns and wildflowers that thrived in dappled shade, were suddenly exposed to harsh sunlight and trampling livestock. The entire ecological web began to fray. But to the medieval mind, this wasn't a crisis. It was progress. More land meant more food. More food meant survival. And survival in a world of famine and war was all that mattered. So if you were a plant in the Dark Ages, your odds weren't great. You were either being chopped down, burned for fuel, grazed by animals, or ploughed under for grain. And if you managed to escape all of that, you were still living in an ecosystem that was collapsing around you, one tree at a time. But the loss of the forests was only the beginning, because once the trees were gone, the soil itself began to die. Picture this. It's the year 800. You're standing at the edge of what will one day be called France. But right now, there are no borders, no nations, just land. And stretching out before you, as far as your eyes can see, is forest. Not the kind you visit on weekends, not the kind with hiking trails and recycling bins. This is the wildwood, ancient, untouched, and utterly indifferent to your existence. The canopy towers above you, a living roof woven from oak, beech, and ash. Some of these trees are 500 years old. Their trunks are wider than a peasant's hut. Their roots plunge deep into soil that's never been ploughed, never been poisoned, never been anything but itself. Beneath them, the understory is thick with hazel, holly, and young saplings fighting for a sliver of sunlight. Ferns carpet the forest's floor. Moss clings to every surface. Fungi bloom in the shadows, decomposing fallen logs and cycling nutrients back into the earth. This forest is not silent. It hums. Insects buzz through shafts of light. Birds call from hidden branches. Somewhere deeper in, a boar snuffles through leaf litter. This is an ecosystem in balance, a web of life so complex that no single thread can be pulled without affecting the whole. And for thousands of years, it has stood here, evolving, adapting, thriving. But by the time the Middle Ages end, this forest will be gone. Not damaged, not reduced, gone. And it won't be a plague that kills it, or a drought, or a storm. It will be humans, axes, fire, and an insatiable hunger for land. The deforestation of medieval Europe is one of history's quietest catastrophes. It doesn't show up in the chronicles the way battles and kings do. but it reshaped the continent more thoroughly than any war. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, Europe lost an estimated 60 to 70% of its original forest cover. In some regions, like England and the Low Countries, the number was even higher. By the year 1400, vast stretches of land that had been woodland for millennia were now open fields, pastures, and barren heath. So what happened? Why did the forests fall? The answer is both simple and tragic. People needed space. The population of Europe had been relatively stable during the early Middle Ages, hovering around 20 to 30 million. But by the 11th century, things began to change. Agricultural improvements, relative peace in some regions, and warmer weather during the medieval warm period allowed populations to grow. By the year 1300, Europe's population had roughly tripled. More people meant more food meant more farmland, and the fastest way to get farmland was to clear forest. So they did. Village by village, acre by acre, the wildwood was hacked down. Peasants were granted permission, sometimes even incentivized, to clear land in exchange for reduced taxes or ownership rights. It was called a sarting, the process of turning forest into arable land, and it happened everywhere. The process was brutal. First, the undergrowth was cut away. Then, the smaller trees were felled. Finally, the great oaks and beeches were taken down, either by axe or by fire. Sometimes, they girdled the trees, cutting a ring around the bark to kill them slowly, letting them stand as dead sentinels while crops were planted beneath. Once the trees were gone, the stumps were dug out or left to rot. The land was ploughed, often poorly, and seeds were scattered. Within a few years, what had been ancient forest was now a wheat field, and no one replanted. The idea of reforestation, of managing forests as a renewable resource, was almost entirely absent from medieval thinking. Trees were obstacles. They blocked sunlight, they took up space, they were useful only when dead. Once a forest was cleared, it was cleared for good. There was no going back. But it wasn't just about farming. Medieval life consumed wood at a staggering rate. Every house, every barn, every fence, every cart was built from timber. A single timber-framed building could require hundreds of trees. And these weren't small structures. Manor houses, churches, and castles demanded massive beams, often oak, often old growth. The trees that had taken centuries to grow were felled in hours. Then there was fuel. Firewood was the only source of heat for cooking and warmth. A typical household burned through several cords of wood each winter. In cities, the demand was even higher. Bakeries, breweries, blacksmiths, dyers, all required constant fires. Wood was so essential that rights to collect it were fiercely guarded. Forests near towns were stripped bare within a few generations. Charcoal production made things worse. To smelt iron, you needed charcoal. To make charcoal, you needed to burn wood slowly in low oxygen pits. The process was incredibly inefficient. It took roughly 10 units of wood to produce 1 unit of charcoal, and medieval Europe was obsessed with iron. Plows, tools, weapons, horseshoes, nails, everything required it. So the forests burned. Not in wild, uncontrolled blazes, but in deliberate, smouldering mounds that consumed entire groves. In some regions, forest management did exist. Coppicing, where trees were cut to stumps and allowed to regrow as multiple thin trunks, was practiced in England and France. Pollarding, where branches were cut high on the trunk to keep them out of reach of grazing animals, was common in areas with livestock. These techniques allowed forests to regenerate, at least partially, but they also changed the character of the woodlands. Old-growth trees, the ancient giants with massive trunks and sprawling root systems, disappeared. What remained were younger, scrappier stands that lacked the complexity and biodiversity of true wilderness. And here's the thing, trees aren't just trees, they're the foundation of entire ecosystems. When you remove a forest, you don't just lose wood, you lose habitat. Birds that nested in the canopy had nowhere to go. Mammals that sheltered in hollow trunks were exposed. Insects that fed on specific tree species vanished. Fungi that formed symbiotic relationships with roots could no longer survive. The understory plants, the ferns and mosses and wildflowers that thrived in the dappled shade of a mature forest were suddenly blasted by full sunlight or trampled by livestock. The soil changed too. Forest floors are built over centuries. Layers of leaf litter, decaying wood, and organic matter create rich, spongy earth that holds water and nutrients. When the trees were cleared, that system collapsed. Rain washed away topsoil, nutrients leached out. The ground became compacted and hard. What had been a living, breathing ecosystem became dirt. Just dirt. By the 13th century, the scale of deforestation was visible even to medieval observers. Chronicles mention the scarcity of timber. Laws were passed trying to regulate cutting, but they were rarely enforced. The economic pressure was too great. Wood was money, land was power, and forests were in the way. Some forests survived, but only because they were protected by the nobility. Royal hunting reserves were off-limits to commoners, preserved not for ecological reasons, but so kings and lords could chase deer and boar. Poaching in these forests could get you executed. The irony is bitter. The only trees that escaped the axe were the ones guarded by violence and privilege. So, if you were a tree in medieval Europe, your survival depended on luck, location, and whether a powerful person decided you were worth more alive than dead. Most weren't that lucky. Most ended up as firewood, charcoal, or fence posts, and the forests that had stood for millennia were reduced to memory. But the loss of the trees was only the beginning, because once the forests were gone, the land itself began to fail. And that's where the real trouble started. So the forests are gone. The ancient oaks have been turned into beams and barrels. The understory has been trampled into mud. And now, finally, you've got what you wanted. Open land, acres and acres of it ready to be ploughed and planted. This should be the beginning of abundance, right? This should be the moment when all that hard work pays off. Except it's not. Because the soil, that thin layer of life between rock and air, is about to betray you. Medieval farmers didn't understand soil the way we do now. They didn't know about nitrogen cycles or microbial communities or the delicate chemistry that keeps dirt alive. To them, soil was just dirt. You put seeds in it, and if God was willing, crops came out. But soil isn't passive. It's not just a medium for growing things. It's an ecosystem in itself, teeming with bacteria, fungi, worms, and microscopic organisms that break down organic matter and release nutrients plants can use. And when you strip away a forest, plough the ground, and plant the same crop year after year, that ecosystem starts to collapse. Let's talk about what soil actually needs to stay healthy. Plants are hungry. They pull nutrients out of the ground to build leaves, stems, roots, and seeds. The big three nutrients they need are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is especially critical. It's a building block of proteins and chlorophyll, the molecule that lets plants photosynthesize. Without nitrogen, plants can't grow. They turn pale, stunted, weak. And here's the problem. Nitrogen doesn't just sit in the soil, waiting to be used. It cycles, it moves. And if you don't replenish it, it runs out. In a natural forest, nitrogen comes from decomposition. Leaves fall, trees die, animals leave waste. Fungi and bacteria break it all down, releasing nitrogen back into the soil. It's a closed loop, constantly recycling. But when you clear a forest and plant a field of wheat, that loop breaks. You're harvesting the crop, which means you're taking the nitrogen out of the system, and medieval farmers had no way to put it back. Not effectively, anyway. They did try. Animal manure was the primary fertilizer, and every scrap of it was precious. Peasants collected dung from their livestock and spread it on their fields, but there was never enough. Most peasants only owned a few animals, maybe a cow, a pig, some chickens. The amount of manure they could produce was nowhere near enough to fertilize an entire field. Wealthier landowners had more animals and therefore more manure, but even they couldn't keep up with the nutrient drain. So, medieval Europe developed a system called the three-field rotation. It was simple. You divided your land into 3 sections. One section was planted with a winter crop like wheat or rye. One section was planted with a spring crop like barley or oats. And one section was left fallow, meaning it sat empty for a year to recover. The next year, you rotated. The fallow field got planted, and one of the others went fallow. It was better than planting the same field every year, but it wasn't enough. Here's why. Leaving a field fallow doesn't magically restore nitrogen. It just stops the drain temporarily. Without organic matter being added, without legumes being planted to fix nitrogen from the air, the soil stayed depleted. And even when fields were fallow, they weren't truly resting. Peasants often grazed their animals on fallow land, which meant the livestock ate whatever sparse vegetation grew there. That vegetation could have decomposed and returned nutrients to the soil. Instead, it was digested and excreted somewhere else, often on common land or roads where it did no good. The result was predictable. Yields dropped. In the early Middle Ages, a good wheat harvest might produce 4 grains for every one planted. That's a 4-to-1 ratio. By the 13th and 14th centuries, in heavily farmed areas, that ratio had fallen to 3-to-1 or even 2-to-1. Imagine planting 100 seeds and only getting 200 back. After saving seed for next year and paying taxes to your lord, you're left with almost nothing. And it wasn't just nitrogen. Phosphorus and potassium were leaching out too. Phosphorus is essential for root development and energy transfer within plant cells. Potassium regulates water uptake and strengthens cell walls. Without them, plants grow weak, shallow-rooted, and vulnerable to disease and drought. Medieval crops were struggling, and the farmers had no idea why. They prayed, they blamed the weather, they blamed themselves, but they couldn't see the invisible depletion happening beneath their feet. Soil structure was deteriorating too. Ploughing breaks up soil, which is necessary for planting, but it also disrupts the network of fungal hyphae and root channels that hold soil together. In a healthy ecosystem, plant roots and fungi create tiny tunnels that let water and air penetrate deep into the ground. When you plough repeatedly, you destroy that structure. The soil becomes compacted, dense, and hard. Water can't infiltrate, so it runs off, carrying topsoil with it. Roots can't penetrate deeply, so plants become shallow and unstable. Erosion became a serious problem. Without tree roots to anchor the soil, rain washed it away. Wind picked up loose dirt from fallow fields and carried it off. Riverbeds filled with sediment. Fertile topsoil, the product of thousands of years of organic accumulation, was lost in a single generation, and once it was gone, it didn't come back. Soil formation is incredibly slow. It takes roughly 500 years to build just 1 inch of topsoil under natural conditions. Medieval farmers were losing it faster than nature could replace it. In some regions, farmers tried to compensate by expanding onto marginal land. Hillsides were plowed, wetlands were drained, forests were cleared even more aggressively, but marginal land is marginal for a reason. The soil is thinner, rockier, less fertile. Crops grown there were even more prone to failure. It was a desperate gamble, and it rarely paid off. There were a few bright spots. Monks in monasteries, who had more time and resources to experiment, sometimes practiced better land management. They grew legumes like peas and beans, which have a remarkable ability. Their roots host bacteria called rhizobia, which pull nitrogen directly from the air and convert it into a form plants can use. When the crop was harvested or ploughed under, that nitrogen stayed in the soil. It was one of the few sustainable practices in medieval agriculture, but it wasn't widespread. Most peasants couldn't afford to dedicate land to anything that wasn't immediately edible. So the soil grew thinner, weaker, and less productive, and the plants that depended on it grew thinner and weaker too. Wheat stalks bent under their own weight. Barley heads were sparse and undersized. Root vegetables struggled to push through compacted earth. The medieval countryside was covered in fields, but those fields were failing. Slowly, silently, and invisibly, the foundation of medieval agriculture was crumbling. And when the soil failed, famine followed. Because a weakened plant isn't just less productive, it's also more vulnerable to disease, to pests, and to a tiny, toxic fungus that would become one of the most feared killers of the Middle Ages. The soil is exhausted, the crops are struggling, and now, just when things couldn't get worse, the weather turns. The year is 1314. Spring arrives late, cold and wet. Summer never really comes. Rain falls in relentless sheets, day after day, week after week. Fields turn to swamps. Seeds rot in the ground before they can sprout, and the crops that do manage to grow are weak, pale, and doomed. This is the beginning of the Great Famine, one of the worst agricultural disasters in European history. It will last 3 years, from 1314 to 1317, though some regions won't recover for a decade. Millions will starve, villages will empty, and the plants, already struggling in depleted soil, will face a crisis they have no defense against. But starvation isn't the only killer, because even when the grain survives, even when the harvest comes in, it isn't always safe to eat. Let's talk about rye. Rye was a staple crop in medieval Europe, especially in northern regions where the soil was too poor and the climate too harsh for wheat. It's a tough plant, more cold-tolerant than wheat, able to grow in sandy or acidic soils where other grains fail. For peasants, rye wasn't a choice. It was survival. They baked it into dense, dark bread that could last for weeks. It wasn't delicious, but it kept you alive. Usually, but rye has a weakness. When conditions are cool and damp, especially during a wet spring or a rainy harvest, it becomes vulnerable to a parasitic fungus called Claviceps purpurea. You probably know it by its common name, ergot. and ergot is one of the most sinister organisms in the plant world. It doesn't just infect rye, it weaponizes it. Here's how it works. Ergot spores land on rye flowers during pollination. If the conditions are right, cool, moist, and prolonged, the fungus begins to grow. It invades the developing grain, replacing the seed with a dark, purple-black structure called a sclerotium. This sclerotium is packed with toxic alkaloids, chemical compounds that affect the human nervous system in horrifying ways. And because the sclerotia look similar to normal rye grains, just slightly darker and elongated, they often go unnoticed during harvest. When people ate bread made from ergot-contaminated rye, they were poisoning themselves. The alkaloids in ergot are vasoconstrictors, meaning they cause blood vessels to tighten and restrict blood flow. In mild cases, this causes tingling, numbness, and a crawling sensation under the skin. In severe cases, it leads to gangrene. Fingers and toes turn black. Limbs lose circulation and begin to rot. The tissue dies while the person is still alive. In the worst outbreaks, people's extremities would simply fall off, blackened and withered, as if burned by invisible fire. That's why ergot poisoning was called St. Anthony's fire. The burning pain was unbearable. Victims described it as if their limbs were being consumed by flames from the inside. Some suffered convulsions. Others hallucinated, seeing visions, hearing voices, experiencing terrifying delusions. The alkaloids in ergot are chemically similar to LSD, which was actually synthesized from ergot compounds in the 20th century. Medieval people had no idea they were tripping on contaminated bread. They thought they were being punished by God or possessed by demons. The Great Famine created perfect conditions for ergot. The endless rain, the cool temperatures, the desperate need to harvest whatever grain survived, all of it conspired to spread the fungus. Peasants, already starving, couldn't afford to throw away bread just because it tasted bitter or looked slightly off. They ate it anyway. And the poison spread through entire communities. Chronicles from the period describe outbreaks of strange illnesses, whole villages afflicted with convulsions, madness, and gangrene, people crawling to churches, begging saints for relief. Some believed it was divine punishment for sin, others blamed witches or bad air. No one understood that the cause was biological, a microscopic fungus hijacking their food supply and turning it into a vector of suffering. Ergotism wasn't new. It had been documented as far back as the 9th century, but it surged during periods of crop failure and poor storage, which meant the Middle Ages saw repeated outbreaks. Monasteries and hospitals run by the Order of St. Anthony became specialized treatment centers. Monks couldn't cure the disease, but they offered care, clean food, and prayer. Often, just eating uncontaminated bread for a few weeks was enough to stop the progression of symptoms. If you caught it early, you might survive. If not, you died slowly, in agony, wondering what sin you'd committed to deserve such a fate. But ergot wasn't the only fungal threat. Rust, smut, and mildew plagued medieval crops constantly. Rust appears as orange or brown pustules on wheat and barley leaves. It's caused by fungi in the Puccinia genus, and it spreads rapidly in humid conditions. Infected plants produce fewer grains, and the grains they do produce are shriveled and lightweight. A field hit by rust could lose half its yield or more. Smut is even more dramatic. It's caused by fungi in the Ustilago family, and it transforms grain kernels into black, powdery masses of spores. When you thresh infected wheat, clouds of dark spores explode into the air. covering everything. The grain is ruined, inedible. And because smut spores can survive in soil and on seed for years, once a field is infected, it's hard to get rid of. Mildew, caused by Bloomeria graminis and related fungi, coats leaves in a white, powdery film. It blocks photosynthesis, weakening the plant and reducing grain production. In damp, cool climates, mildew spreads like wildfire, hopping from plant to plant on the wind. Medieval farmers had no fungicides, no resistant crop varieties, no way to fight back. They just watched their fields turn grey and hope for better weather next year. All of these diseases were made worse by medieval farming practices, monocultures, planting the same crop in the same field year after year, created perfect conditions for pathogens to thrive. Dense planting, necessary to maximize yield, meant plants were packed close together, making it easy for spores to spread. Poor seed selection meant infected seeds were replanted, carrying disease into the next generation. And without crop rotation or disease-resistant varieties, there was no break in the cycle. So the plants of medieval Europe were under siege, not just from axes and ploughs, but from invisible enemies they had no defense against. Fungi that turned their seeds into poison, blights that shriveled their leaves, rusts that drained their vitality, and the humans who depended on them had no idea how to stop it. They prayed, they fasted. They blamed the stars, the moon, the sins of their neighbors, but the fungi didn't care about prayers. They just kept spreading, silent and relentless. And when the grain was contaminated, when the bread was laced with toxins, people didn't just go hungry. They went mad, convulsed, and rotted from the inside out. The plants that were supposed to sustain life became agents of death. And the worst part? No one understood why. The invisible war between fungus and grain was fought in silence, and the plants, as always, had no voice to warn anyone. But while cultivated crops were under assault from disease, wild plants faced a different kind of threat. One driven not by hunger for food, but by desperation for healing. And that desperation would strip the countryside bare of some of its most powerful species. The crops are failing, the bread is poisoned, and now when sickness comes, and it always comes, people turn to the only medicine they know, plants. Not the ones they grow in careful rows, but the wild ones, the ones that grow in ditches and clearings and deep in the remaining forest. Plants with names that sound like spells: foxglove, mandrake, belladonna, henbane, plants that can heal or kill depending on the dose. And in medieval Europe, those plants are about to be loved to death. Medieval medicine was a strange blend of observation, tradition, superstition, and desperation. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of germ theory. When you got sick, you had 3 options: pray, bleed, or take herbs. And since praying didn't always work and bleeding often made things worse, herbs became the backbone of medieval healthcare. Every village had someone, usually a woman, who knew which plants could bring down a fever, ease a cough, or help a difficult birth. This knowledge was passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, and guarded carefully. Some of it was surprisingly effective. Willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, was used to reduce pain and fever. Chamomile was brewed into tea to calm anxiety and aid digestion. Garlic was used to treat infections, and while medieval healers didn't know about allicin, the antimicrobial compound in garlic, they knew it worked. Street. John's wort was prescribed for wounds and melancholy, and modern research has confirmed it has mild antidepressant properties. These weren't placebo remedies. They were biochemically active compounds that genuinely affected the human body. But here's the problem. Effective plants were in high demand, and there was no concept of sustainable harvesting. If foxglove could slow a racing heart, you picked as much as you could find. If mandrake root was believed to cure infertility or act as a painkiller, you dug up everyone you saw. If belladonna could dilate pupils or ease muscle spasms, you stripped the plants bare. No one thought about leaving some behind to reproduce. No one considered that a species could vanish. Take foxglove digitalis purpurea. It's a beautiful plant, tall spikes of tubular purple flowers that grow in woodland clearings and disturbed ground. Inside those flowers are cardiac glycosides, compounds that affect heart rhythm. In the right dose, they can regulate an irregular heartbeat. In the wrong dose, they stop your heart entirely. Medieval herbalists used foxglove carefully, but they used it constantly. And because it was so valuable, it was over-harvested in many regions. Wild populations dwindled. The plant became scarce, and healers had to travel farther to find it. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, was even more problematic. This plant has a thick, forked root that sometimes resembles a human figure, and that resemblance made it one of the most mythologized plants in medieval Europe. People believed it screamed when pulled from the ground and that the sound could drive you mad or kill you. So they tied dogs to the plants and had the dogs pull them up instead. It's absurd, but it shows how desperately people wanted this plant. Mandrake contains tropane alkaloids, the same class of compounds found in belladonna and henbane. These alkaloids are powerful. They cause drowsiness, hallucinations, and muscle relaxation. In small amounts, mandrake was used as an anesthetic, a sedative, and a painkiller. It was one of the few plants that could dull the agony of surgery or childbirth. But because of its reputation and its potency, mandrake was harvested relentlessly. By the late Middle Ages, it was rare in the wild, and demand far outstripped supply. Belladonna. Atropa belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was another high-demand plant. Its berries are glossy, black, and extremely toxic. Just a few can kill a child. But, in controlled doses, the alkaloids in belladonna, primarily atropine, have medicinal uses. They dilate the pupils, which is why fashionable women in the Renaissance used it as a cosmetic, hence the name belladonna, beautiful lady. They also relax smooth muscle, making belladonna useful for treating cramps, spasms, and certain digestive issues. But using belladonna was a gamble. The line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one is razor thin. Medieval herbalists had no way to standardize dosage. They couldn't measure alkaloid concentrations. They just knew that a little bit helped and a lot killed, and yet people kept using it because the alternatives were worse. If you were in enough pain, if your child was sick enough, you took the risk. And that meant belladonna was constantly being harvested from the wild, stripped from hedgerows and forest edges until it became harder and harder to find. Then there was henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. Another member of the nightshade family, henbane contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, both potent psychoactive compounds. It was used as a painkiller, a sedative, and, in some darker corners of medieval life, as a poison. Henbane induces a dreamy, dissociative state. It can cause hallucinations, delirium, and amnesia. In the wrong hands, it was a tool for murder or coercion. In the right hands, it was one of the few plants that could offer relief from unbearable pain. But like all the other powerful medicinal plants, henbane was overharvested. It grew in waste places, along roadsides, near ruins. It wasn't rare at first, but as populations grew and demand increased, those waste places were cleared, ploughed, or grazed. The plant's habitat shrank. And because it was annual, meaning it had to reseed itself every year, disruption of its habitat meant local populations could vanish quickly. Monasteries tried to preserve some of this knowledge. Monks and nuns cultivated physic gardens, small plots where medicinal plants were grown intentionally. These gardens were carefully tended, organized by use, and documented in herbals, manuscripts that described each plant's appearance and medicinal properties. Some of these herbals survive today, and they're fascinating. Detailed illustrations, recipes for poultices, tinctures, and teas, instructions on when to harvest, how to dry, how to store. But monastic gardens were tiny oases in a vast landscape of extraction. Most people didn't have access to cultivated herbs, and they depended on wild plants, and they took what they needed without thought for the future, and the harvesting was often wrapped in ritual and superstition. You were supposed to pick certain plants only under a full moon. Others had to be harvested before dawn or after sunset. Some required prayers or incantations. These rituals might have slowed the pace of harvesting slightly, making it more deliberate, but they didn't stop it. There were also plants harvested, not for medicine, but for magic. Mugwort was used in divination. Vervain was believed to ward off evil spirits. Rue was planted near doorways for protection. Whether these plants had any real power is beside the point. People believed they did, and so they were gathered, bundled, and hung in homes across Europe. The line between herbalism and superstition was blurry, and plants paid the price either way. By the late Middle Ages, many wild medicinal plants had become scarce. Healers had to travel farther, pay more, or make do with substitutes. Some species disappeared from entire regions. Others survived only in inaccessible areas, on cliffs or deep in forests where people couldn't easily reach them. The plants that had once been abundant, reliable, and free were now rare, expensive, and hoarded. And the irony is brutal. These plants were being destroyed because people needed them, because they worked, because in a world without modern medicine, a handful of foxglove or a root of mandrake could mean the difference between life and death. The very effectiveness of these plants sealed their fate. So, while cultivated crops struggled under the weight of human hunger, wild medicinal plants struggled under the weight of human pain. Both were being harvested faster than they could recover, both were disappearing, and both were utterly silent about their suffering. But at least medicinal plants were valued, at least they were sought after. The next group of plants had no such luck. They were simply fuel, and they were about to burn. It's winter. The year is 1200 and something. You're cold. Not the kind of cold where you put on a sweater and complain. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. Your home is a wooden hut with gaps in the walls. There's no insulation, no glass in the windows, just cloth or shutters that do almost nothing to keep the wind out. Your only source of heat is a fire, and to keep that fire burning, you need wood, a lot of wood, more wood than you can imagine. This is the reality for millions of people in medieval Europe. Fire isn't a luxury, it's survival. You need it to cook your food, to boil water so it doesn't kill you, to heat your home so you don't freeze to death in your sleep. And every bit of that heat comes from burning wood. There's no coal industry yet, not on a large scale. There's no natural gas, no electricity, no alternative, just wood. And the demand is relentless, insatiable, and utterly devastating to the forests that remain. Let's start with the basics. How much firewood does a medieval household actually use? Estimates vary, but a typical peasant family would burn through roughly 4 to 6 cords of wood per year. A cord is a stack of wood measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. That's a lot of trees, and that's just for one family. Multiply that by every household in every village, and you start to see the scale of consumption. But it's not just about heating homes. Cooking requires constant fire. Medieval meals took hours to prepare. Pottage had to simmer all day. Bread had to be baked in communal ovens that burned continuously. Meat, when available, had to be roasted or smoked for preservation. Every meal meant more wood turning to ash. And in towns and cities, where populations were denser, the demand was even higher. Bakeries, breweries, and smithies all required fire, and fire required fuel. Then there's charcoal. If firewood was essential, charcoal was indispensable. Charcoal is wood that's been burned slowly in a low oxygen environment, driving off moisture and volatile compounds and leaving behind almost pure carbon. It burns hotter and cleaner than regular wood, which makes it perfect for metalworking. And medieval Europe ran on metal. Iron plows, tools, weapons, horseshoes, nails, hinges, locks, everything required iron. And iron required charcoal. The process of making charcoal was brutal. You'd pile wood into a mound, cover it with earth and turf to limit oxygen, and then set it smouldering. It would burn for days, slowly converting wood into charcoal, but the efficiency was terrible. It took roughly 10 units of wood to produce 1 unit of charcoal. That's a 90% loss. To make enough charcoal to supply a single blacksmith for a year, you'd need to burn entire groves of trees. And blacksmiths were everywhere. Every village had at least one, larger towns had dozens, cities had entire quarters dedicated to metalworking, where forges burned day and night, filling the air with smoke and the constant clang of hammers on anvils. Each forge demanded charcoal. Each load of charcoal represented a forest reduced to ash. The trees weren't just being cut down, they were being incinerated at an industrial scale. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the pressure on forests was so intense that some regions began experiencing what we'd now call a fuel crisis. Areas near towns and cities were stripped of trees within a few miles radius. People had to travel farther and farther to find wood. In England, records show that firewood prices tripled in some regions over the course of a century. What had once been free for the taking now required money, permits, or back-breaking labor. Some places tried to manage the problem. Coppicing, where you cut a tree down to a stump and let it regrow as multiple thin trunks, became standard practice in many forests. It allowed for a sustainable harvest, at least in theory. You could return to the same coppice every 7 to 15 years and cut the regrown poles for firewood or charcoal. It worked, but only if you had enough forest to rotate through. And in many areas, demand had already outpaced regeneration. Pollarding was another technique. Instead of cutting the tree at ground level, you'd cut it higher up, above the reach of grazing animals. The tree would sprout new branches from the top of the trunk, and you could harvest those every few years. It was less efficient than coppicing, but it worked in areas where livestock and wild deer would otherwise eat the regrowth. Both methods kept trees alive, technically, but they also transformed forests. Instead of towering oaks and beeches, you got scrubby, multi-stemmed stands that lacked the grandeur and ecological complexity of old growth. And even with coppicing and pollarding, it wasn't enough. The math didn't work. A coppiced tree might produce a useful harvest every decade, but a family needed wood every year. A blacksmith needed charcoal every week. The gap between supply and demand kept widening, and forests kept shrinking. In some regions, people turned to alternatives. Peat, partially decomposed plant matter dug from bogs, could be dried and burned. It was smoky, smelly, and less efficient than wood, but it was better than freezing. In coastal areas, people burned dried seaweed or driftwood. In treeless uplands, they burned heather, gorse, or even dried animal dung. None of these were good substitutes. They burned quickly, produced less heat, and filled homes with acrid smoke. But when the trees were gone, you burned what you could find. The wealthy had it easier. Lords and nobles controlled vast estates, including forests reserved for their private use. These hunting forests were protected by law. Poaching wood from a royal forest could get you fined, imprisoned, or even executed. The same trees that peasants desperately needed for survival were off limits, preserved so that kings could chase deer through the undergrowth. The irony was bitter. The forests that survived were the ones guarded by violence and privilege. But even noble estates weren't immune to pressure. Castles required massive amounts of timber for construction and maintenance. Kitchens serving hundreds of people burned through firewood at staggering rates. And when nobles went to war, which was often, they needed even more wood. Siege engines like trebuchets and battering rams were built on site from local timber. Palisades and defensive structures consumed entire groves. War and comfort both demanded fuel, and fuel meant trees had to die. By the 14th century, some forests had been so thoroughly exploited that they existed only in name. Legal documents might refer to a forest, but in reality it was just scrubland, a patchwork of stumps, coppice stools, and thorny undergrowth where a few struggling saplings tried to reclaim the space. The ancient wildwood, the deep, dark forests of legend, were almost entirely gone. What remained were managed, controlled, and heavily harvested stands that bore little resemblance to the ecosystems they'd replaced. And the plants themselves paid the price. Young trees, cut before they could mature, never developed the deep root systems that stabilize soil and support fungal networks. They never produced the large seed crops that fed wildlife. They never grew the thick, furrowed bark that hosted lichens and insects. The forests were alive, technically, but they were shadows of what they'd been. Ecological function had been replaced by economic function. The trees existed to serve human needs and nothing more. So, every winter, as fires burned in hearths across Europe, the forests shrank a little more. Every forge that roared to life consumed another grove. Every loaf of bread baked, every pot of stew simmered, every room warmed against the cold, all of it was paid for in trees. And the trees, as always, had no choice. They stood, they burned, and they disappeared. But firewood wasn't the only reason trees were falling. Because while peasants burned them for warmth and blacksmiths turned them into tools, kings and generals were turning them into weapons. And when war came, forests didn't just shrink, they vanished. War in the Middle Ages was a slow, grinding affair. Armies moved on foot, supplies were hauled by cart and oxen. Battles were fought with swords, spears, and arrows. But when it came to sieging a castle or fortifying a position, When it came to building the machines that could break walls or the fleets that could dominate seas, there was only one material that mattered: wood. And medieval Europe was constantly at war, which meant forests weren't just being cleared for farms and fuel, they were being dismantled for conquest. Let's start with siege engine. If you wanted to take a fortified city or castle, you needed to either starve them out, which could take months, or break through their defenses. And breaking through meant building machines. Trebuchets, catapults, battering rams, siege towers, all of them required enormous amounts of timber. A single trebuchet, the counterweight kind that could hurl stones weighing 200 pounds or more, needed massive beams for the frame, a sturdy pivot, and a long throwing arm. You couldn't just use any wood. You needed strong, straight timbers, preferably oak or ash, trees that had grown tall and thick over decades. And these machines weren't built in workshops and transported. They were too big, too heavy. They were constructed on site, near the battlefield, which meant armies had to harvest local forests. When a siege began, the surrounding countryside was stripped. Trees were felled, shaped, and assembled into engines of war. It didn't matter if those trees were part of a managed forest or a sacred grove. War didn't care about sustainability. It cared about victory. Battering rams were simpler but still required substantial timber. You needed a long, heavy log, often reinforced with iron at the tip, suspended from a frame so it could swing. Teams of men would push it back and forth, slamming it into gates or walls until something gave. The frame had to be sturdy enough to absorb the impact, and the log had to be dense and heavy. That meant old-growth trees. Young, fast-grown timber wouldn't do the job. You needed wood that had grown slowly, developing tight grain and maximum strength. Siege towers were even more ambitious. These were multi-story wooden structures, sometimes as tall as the walls they were meant to scale. They were built with wheels or rollers so they could be pushed up to the fortifications. Soldiers would climb inside, protected by thick wooden walls, and then storm out onto the battlements when the tower reached the wall. Building one required not just timber but engineering. Joints had to be strong. The structure had to be balanced. And it had to withstand arrows, stones, and fire. Hundreds of trees went into a single siege tower, and if it burned, which it often did, all that wood turned to ash in minutes. Then there were palisades and defensive fortifications. When an army camped, they didn't just pitch tents and hope for the best. They built temporary wooden walls, ditches, and stakes to protect against surprise attacks. These palisades were made from sharpened logs driven into the ground, forming a barrier that was difficult to breach. A large army could surround itself with miles of wooden fortifications, all of it harvested from nearby forests. And when the army moved on, the palisades were left behind, rotting monuments to a campaign that had consumed an entire woodland. Naval warfare added another layer of demand. Medieval ships, whether for trade or war, were built entirely from wood, and not just any wood. Shipbuilding required specific types of timber for different parts of the vessel. Oak was prized for the keel and ribs because it was strong and resistant to rot. Pine or fir was used for planking because it was lighter and easier to work. Masts required tall, straight trees, often imported from Scandinavia or the Baltic, where such trees still grew. A single warship could require hundreds of mature trees. A large fleet could deforest an entire region. England, which became a dominant naval power, consumed vast stretches of oak forest for its shipyards. Coastal forests were systematically harvested, and when local supplies ran low, Timber was imported from further inland or from other countries. The Royal Navy's appetite for oak became so intense that by the 17th century, England faced a timber crisis. But the seeds of that crisis were planted in the Middle Ages, when shipbuilding first became a strategic priority. And it wasn't just about building ships. Ships needed constant maintenance. Planks rotted, masts cracked, hulls were damaged in storms or battles. Repairs required fresh timber, which meant a steady supply had to be maintained. Shipyards became permanent fixtures in coastal towns, and the forests around them were managed, or more accurately, mined, for timber. The line between sustainable use and exploitation was crossed early and often. Strategic deforestation was also a tactic. If you wanted to deny resources to an enemy, you burned their forests. You cut down trees along roads and rivers to prevent them from building siege engines or ships. You cleared land around your own fortifications so attackers would have no cover and no materials. Forests became military assets, and controlling them became part of warfare. This meant that even forests far from battlefields weren't safe. If they were strategically valuable, they were targets. There are records of armies deliberately destroying orchards and woodlands as they retreated, following a scorched earth policy. If you couldn't hold the land, you made sure your enemy couldn't use it either. Trees were felled and left to rot. Fruit trees were cut down or burned. Vineyards were torn up. The goal was to make the land as inhospitable as possible, and it worked. But the ecological cost was staggering. Orchards that had taken decades to mature were gone in days. Forests that had provided food, shelter, and fuel for communities were reduced to charred stumps. Even in peacetime, the military's appetite for wood didn't diminish. Castles required constant repair and expansion. Wooden scaffolding was needed for stone construction. Arrow shafts had to be made by the thousands. Bows, especially the feared English longbow, were carved from yew, a slow-growing tree that was harvested so heavily it became rare in England. Yew forests in Wales and Ireland were systematically cut down, and eventually England had to import yew from Spain and Italy just to keep its archers supplied. The longbow itself is a fascinating case study in resource depletion. A good warbow was made from a single piece of yew, cut so that the dense heartwood formed the belly of the bow and the flexible sapwood formed the back. This combination gave the bow its power and resilience. But it required selecting specific trees, often older ones with the right proportions of heartwood to sapwood. Not every yew tree was suitable. And because demand was so high, suitable trees became increasingly rare. By the 14th century, laws were passed in England requiring that yew be preserved, and that bowyers, the craftsmen who made bows, use imported wood when possible. But enforcement was weak, and demand was relentless. Archers needed bows needed yew, and yew, slow-growing and increasingly scarce, paid the price. The geopolitical implications of timber were profound. Control of forests meant control of military power. Nations with abundant timber could build large navies and equip massive armies. Nations without had to import, which made them dependent and vulnerable. Timber became a strategic resource, like oil in the modern world, and just like oil, its extraction reshaped landscapes and destabilized ecosystems. So while peasants were burning wood to stay warm and blacksmiths were burning it to forge tools, kings and generals were burning it to wage war. Forests fell not just to feed the living, but to fuel the ambitions of the powerful. And the trees, as always, had no say in the matter. They stood in the path of history, and history cut them down. But not all the changes happening to medieval plants were caused by human hands, because while axes and fires were reshaping the landscape, the climate itself was beginning to shift. And when the weather turned, plants that had survived human exploitation suddenly faced a threat they couldn't adapt to: cold. The forests are shrinking, the soil is failing, the wars are consuming what's left. And now, just when plants have been pushed to the edge, the weather itself betrays them, because climate in the Middle Ages wasn't stable. It shifted, warmed, cooled, and shifted again, forcing plants to adapt or die, and most of them didn't have time to do either. Let's start with the medieval warm period, a stretch of relatively mild weather that lasted roughly from 950 to 1250. For about 300 years, Europe experienced warmer summers and milder winters. Glaciers in the Alps and Scandinavia retreated. Growing seasons lengthened. Crops that had struggled in the north suddenly thrived. Vineyards spread into England and southern Scandinavia, regions where grapes had never ripened before. It seemed like a golden age for agriculture, and in some ways it was. But warmth isn't universally good for plants. Yes, longer growing seasons meant more time for crops to mature, but warmth also meant drought. Summers in southern Europe became hotter and drier. Rivers shrank, wells ran dry. Plants that depended on consistent moisture, forest understory species, wetland vegetation, even some crops, began to struggle. Droughts stressed ecosystems in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Trees stopped producing as many seeds. Shrubs grew smaller, less dense foliage. Wildflowers bloomed earlier and faded faster, throwing off the timing of pollinators. And drought wasn't the only problem. Warmer weather brought pests. Insects that had been limited by cold winters suddenly thrived. Locusts, which had always been a threat in southern regions, began appearing farther north. Swarms could darken the sky, descending on fields and stripping them bare in hours. Medieval chronicles describe locust plagues as acts of divine wrath, clouds of insects so dense they blocked the sunday. They devoured everything: wheat, barley, vegetables, even the leaves off trees. And when they moved on, they left nothing but stubble and famine. Fungal diseases also spread more easily in warm, humid conditions: rust, smut, and mildew. The same diseases we talked about earlier flourished during the medieval warm period. Warm days and cool nights created perfect conditions for fungal spores to germinate and spread. Fields that looked healthy one week could be covered in rust pustules the next. And because medieval farmers had no fungicides, no resistant crop varieties, and no understanding of how these diseases spread, they were helpless to stop them. Then, around 1300, the climate began to shift again. The medieval warm period ended, and the Little Ice Age began. It wasn't a true ice age, not in the geological sense, but it was a significant cooling. Winters became longer and harsher. Summers were cooler and wetter. Glaciers in the Alps advanced, crushing villages and farmland under rivers of ice. In Greenland, Norse settlements that had thrived during the warm period were abandoned, as the cold made agriculture impossible. For plants, this was catastrophic. Species that had adapted to warmer conditions, or had at least survived them, were now facing cold they weren't equipped to handle. Vineyards in England withered. The grapes froze on the vine. By the mid-14th century, most English vineyards had been abandoned. The same thing happened across northern Europe. Olive groves in southern France died back. Orchards failed. Even hardy crops like rye and oats struggled to ripen before the first frost. The transition wasn't gradual. It was punctuated by extreme weather events. The year 1315, the first year of the Great Famine, saw endless rain. Spring planting was delayed because fields were too waterlogged to plough. Summer never really came. Crops rotted in the ground. Hay couldn't be dried, so livestock starved. The cold, wet conditions persisted for 3 years, and by the time the weather improved, millions had died of starvation and disease. Plants that had evolved over thousands of years to handle a certain range of temperatures and rainfall suddenly found themselves outside that range. And evolution doesn't work on human timescales. It takes generations, sometimes thousands of generations, for a species to adapt to new conditions. A single cold snap or a few years of drought won't cause evolution. It just causes death. Some species did better than others. Weeds, those opportunistic plants that thrive in disturbed soil, were surprisingly resilient. Dandelions, nettles, thistles, plantain, they all tolerated a wide range of condition. They could germinate quickly, grow fast, and produce seeds before conditions turned lethal. They weren't the plants people wanted, but they were the plants that survived. Meanwhile, more specialized species, the ones that required specific soil types, moisture levels, or temperatures, began to disappear from large areas. Forests suffered too, though more slowly. Trees live for decades or centuries, so a single bad year won't kill them. But a decade of cold, wet summers weakens them. Growth rings narrow, seed production drops, saplings fail to establish. Old trees hang on, but when they die, there's nothing to replace them. Over time, forests thin out, and the species composition shifts toward hardier, less specialized trees. The Little Ice Age also affected water availability in unexpected ways. Yes, there was more rain, but much of it fell at the wrong times or in the wrong places. Spring floods washed away topsoil. Summer rains came too late to help crops, and in winter, rivers and streams froze solid, cutting off water supplies for months. Plants that depended on consistent moisture, wetland species, riparian vegetation, plants along riverbanks, were hit hard. Some wetlands dried up entirely during brief warm spells, only to flood catastrophically when the rains returned. And then there were the storms. The Little Ice Age brought more frequent and more violent weather. Gales ripped through forests, toppling trees that had stood for centuries. Hailstorms flattened fields of grain. Late frosts killed blossoms, ensuring no fruit or seed would form that year. Each of these events was a small disaster. Together, over decades, they reshaped ecosystems. Medieval people noticed the changes, but they didn't understand them. They saw the cold, the rain, the failed harvests, and they blamed themselves. They believed God was punishing them for their sins. They held special masses, fasted, prayed, and flagellated themselves in the streets, hoping to appease divine wrath. But the climate didn't care about prayers. It shifted according to forces far beyond human control. Solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, ocean currents, and plants, caught between human exploitation and climatic chaos, simply endured or died. The irony is brutal. Humans had spent centuries clearing forests, depleting soil, and over-harvesting wild plants. They had weakened ecosystems to the point where resilience was almost gone. And then, just when those ecosystems needed strength to weather a climate shift, they had none left. The plants that might have adapted, the diverse, genetically varied populations that could have produced cold-tolerant or drought-resistant offspring, were already gone. What remained were struggling monocultures, overgrazed pastures, and exhausted woodlands with no reserves to draw on. So the medieval warm period lured plants into vulnerable positions, spreading them north, encouraging warmth-loving species, creating ecosystems that depended on mild conditions. And then the Little Ice Age slammed the door. The cold came back harder and longer than before, and the plants that had flourished were left exposed. Some retreated south, some died out entirely in northern regions, and some, the weeds, the survivors, the generalists, just kept going, quietly outlasting everything else. But climate wasn't the only invisible threat, because while temperature and rainfall were shifting, something else was moving through the fields and forests. Something small, relentless, and utterly indifferent to whether the weather was warm or cold. Pests, diseases, the silent plagues that didn't kill people but destroyed the plants they depended on. You've survived the axes, you've endured the droughts and the floods. You've adapted, barely, to soil that's been stripped of nutrients and a climate that can't make up its mind. And now, just when you think things can't get worse, they arrive. Not with warning, not with mercy. Just wings and mandibles and an appetite that never stops. Welcome to the world of medieval pests, where being a plant means being food for something that multiplies faster than you can grow. Let's start with locusts. These aren't your garden variety grasshoppers. Locusts are a phase that certain grasshopper species enter under specific conditions. When populations are low and resources are abundant, they're solitary, green or brown, relatively calm. But when conditions shift, when drought concentrates them into smaller areas with limited food, something remarkable and terrifying happens. They transform. Their color changes to yellow and black. Their wings grow longer. Their behavior shifts from solitary to swarming, and they become one of the most destructive forces in nature. A single locust swarm can contain billions of insects, not millions, billions. They can cover hundreds of square miles, moving like a living storm across the landscape, and when they descend on a field, they eat everything. Wheat, barley, oats, vegetables, leaves, bark, even the thatch on roofs if they're desperate enough. A large swarm can strip an entire region bare in a matter of hours. What took months to grow is gone before sunset. Medieval chronicles describe locust plagues with a mix of awe and horror. They appeared as clouds on the horizon, darkening the sky, blotting out the Sunday. The sound of their wings was compared to rushing water or distant thunder. When they landed, the noise of millions of insects chewing was loud enough to be heard from a distance. Fields that had been green in the morning were brown stubble by evening, and there was nothing anyone could do. No pesticides, no strategies. Just prayer and helplessness. Locust plagues weren't constant, but they weren't rare either. They tended to follow droughts, which were common during the medieval warm period and the early stages of the Little Ice Age. Southern Europe and the Mediterranean saw them more frequently, but they occasionally swept north into France and even England. Each outbreak meant famine. Each swarm meant starvation for the communities in its path, and for the plants, it meant total annihilation. But locusts were just the most dramatic pest. There were others, smaller, quieter, but just as devastating. Take aphids. These tiny, soft-bodied insects pierce plant stems and leaves with needle-like mouthparts and suck out sap. A single aphid isn't much of a threat, but aphids reproduce astonishingly fast. Under ideal conditions, A single female can produce dozens of live, young, no mating required, in a matter of days. Those young mature rapidly and start reproducing themselves. Within weeks, a few aphids become thousands. Within a month, millions. Aphids weaken plants by draining their fluids, but they also spread disease. Many plant viruses are transmitted through aphid saliva. When an aphid feeds on an infected plant and then moves to a healthy one, it carries the virus with it. Medieval farmers had no idea this was happening. They just saw their crops wilting, yellowing, and dying for no apparent reason. They blamed bad air, curses, or divine punishment. But the real culprit was microscopic, invisible, and spreading through every bite. Then there were caterpillars. The larvae of moths and butterflies might seem harmless, even charming in small numbers. But certain species, when conditions are right, can explode in population. Armyworms, for example, are the caterpillars of a particular moth species, and they move across fields in massive groups, devouring everything in their path. They're called armyworms because they move like an army, in coordinated waves, stripping one field and then marching to the next. Medieval Europe saw periodic outbreaks of caterpillar infestations. Fruit trees were especially vulnerable. Caterpillars would defoliate entire orchards, leaving trees bare and unable to produce fruit. Without leaves, trees can't photosynthesize. Without photosynthesis, they can't make energy. Weakened trees become susceptible to disease, frost damage, and secondary pest attacks. A single infestation could ruin an orchard for years. And then there were the fungal diseases, which we've touched on before but deserve more attention. Rust, caused by fungi in the Puccinia genus, is one of the oldest and most persistent plant diseases in history. It shows up as orange or reddish-brown pustules on the leaves and stems of wheat, barley, and other grains. These pustules are packed with spores, which burst open and spread on the wind, infecting nearby plants. Rust doesn't necessarily kill the plant outright, but it weakens it severely. Infected plants produce smaller, lighter grains. In bad years, yields can drop by 50% or more. Rust thrives in warm, humid conditions, which is why it was such a problem during the medieval warm period. Morning dew, afternoon heat, and evening moisture created perfect conditions for spores to germinate. And because medieval farmers planted crops densely, often in the same fields year after year, the disease had ample opportunity to spread. There was no crop rotation sophisticated enough to break the cycle, no fungicides, no resistant varieties, just plants struggling to survive and fungi exploiting every weakness. Smut is another fungal nightmare. Unlike rust, which lives on the surface of the plant, smut invades the seeds themselves. The fungus replaces the grain with a black, powdery mass of spores. When you thresh infected wheat, the spores explode into the air, coating everything and everyone nearby. The grain is ruined, inedible, worthless. And because smut spores can survive in soil and on seed for years, once a field is infected, it's almost impossible to clean. There are records of entire harvests being lost to smut. Farmers would bring in what looked like a decent crop, only to discover during threshing that half the grain had been replaced by black powder. The economic and psychological toll was devastating. You'd worked all season, survived the weather, avoided locusts, and then at the last moment, the disease revealed itself. All that labor for nothing. Mildew, caused by fungi in the Erysipelas order, is less dramatic but equally damaging. It appears as a white, powdery coating on leaves, stems, and sometimes even grain heads. The fungus blocks light from reaching the leaf surface, which reduces photosynthesis. Infected plants grow slower, produce less, and are more vulnerable to other stresses. Mildew spreads quickly in cool, damp conditions, which means it thrived during the Little Ice Age, especially in Northern Europe. And here's the thing about all these pests and diseases. They fed on each other's damage. A plant weakened by aphids was more susceptible to rust. A plant stressed by drought was more vulnerable to mildew. A field stripped by locusts had no buffer, no biodiversity to slow the spread of disease. Medieval agriculture had created the perfect conditions for cascading failures. Monocultures, dense plantings, poor soil, and climate stress all combined to make plants sitting targets. Medieval people tried to fight back in their own way. They held religious processions, praying for relief from plagues. They blessed their fields with holy water. They hung charms and talismans to ward off evil. In some regions, they practiced rituals meant to drive insects away, ringing bells, lighting fires, or even excommunicating the pests in mock religious trials. Yes, actual trials where locusts or caterpillars were formally accused, tried, and sentenced by the church. It sounds absurd now, but it shows how desperate people were. None of it worked, of course. The pests didn't care about prayers or excommunications. They cared about food, reproduction, and survival. And medieval plants, already pushed to the edge by human exploitation and climate chaos, were abundant, easy targets. The insects thrived. The fungi spread, and the plants, silent and rooted, could only endure the assault. So, if you were a plant in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't just about avoiding the axe or the plough. It was about outlasting swarms, resisting invisible spores, and somehow producing seeds despite being eaten, infected, and stressed beyond measure. Most didn't make it, but a few, the tough ones, the adaptable ones, found ways to survive. And that, more than anything, is the story of medieval botany. Not abundance, but endurance. But while wild plants were being devoured by pests and diseases, cultivated plants faced a different kind of assault. One that was slower, subtler, and ultimately just as destructive. Because medieval farmers, in their desperation to improve their crops, were accidentally weakening them. Medieval farmers weren't stupid. They didn't understand genetics or heredity in the modern sense, but they weren't blind. They noticed that some plants grew taller, produced more grain, or resisted disease better than others. And they did what seemed logical. They saved seeds from the best plants and replanted them year after year. It's called selective breeding, and it's one of humanity's oldest agricultural practices. But in the Middle Ages, without any understanding of how inheritance actually worked, they were playing a dangerous game, and the plants paid the price. Let's start with what they were trying to do. Imagine you're a medieval farmer. You've just harvested your wheat. Most of it is mediocre, thin stalks with small heads of grain. But a few plants, maybe 1 in 50, look exceptional, taller, fuller, healthier. So, you set those aside. You don't eat them, you don't sell them, you save them for planting next spring. It makes perfect sense. If those plants were the best this year, maybe their offspring will be the best next year. And, to some extent, it works. Traits like height, grain size, and disease resistance do have a genetic component. If you consistently select for those traits over many generations, you can shift the population toward more desirable characteristics. This is how wheat, barley, and other crops were domesticated in the first place, thousands of years before the Middle Ages. Early farmers selected the plants with the biggest seeds, the ones that didn't shatter and scatter when ripe, the ones that tasted better. Over millennia, wild grasses became the staple crops we recognize today. But medieval farmers didn't have millennia. They had one growing season, then another, each one a gamble against famine. And they didn't have the luxury of maintaining diverse populations. They needed food, immediately and consistently, so they selected hard. Every year, they chose the best plants. Every year, they narrowed the gene pool a little more. And every year, their crops became more uniform, more predictable, and more vulnerable. Here's the problem. Genetic diversity is a population's insurance policy. In any field of wheat, there's natural variation. Some plants are taller, some are shorter. Some resist rust better, some handle drought better. This variation exists because each plant has a slightly different combination of genes inherited from its parents. When a new stress appears, disease, drought, a cold snap, some of those plants will happen to have the right combination of traits to survive. They reproduce, and the population recovers. But when you select only the tallest, most productive plants year after year, you're eliminating variation. You're keeping the genes for height and yield, but you might be losing the genes for disease resistance, drought tolerance, or adaptability. And you won't know you've lost them until it's too late. Until a new disease shows up and wipes out your entire crop because every single plant is genetically similar and therefore equally vulnerable. Medieval farmers didn't understand this. They saw immediate results, bigger harvests, taller plants, and assumed they were improving their crops. And in the short term, they were. But in the long term, they were creating populations that were genetically narrow, fragile, and dependent on stable conditions. And, as we've already discussed, medieval conditions were anything but stable. There's also the problem of inbreeding. Plants, like animals, can suffer from inbreeding depression. When closely related individuals reproduce, harmful recessive genes are more likely to be expressed. In a large, diverse population, these genes are diluted, masked by healthier dominant versions, but in a small, isolated population, they accumulate. You start seeing weird problems, reduced fertility, stunted growth, increased susceptibility to disease. The plants don't look sick exactly, they just look weaker, less vigorous, less able to handle stress. Medieval seed-saving practices made inbreeding almost inevitable. Farmers saved seed from their own fields, which meant the plants were already related. They traded seed with neighbors, but those neighbors were often selecting for the same traits in the same way. Over generations, entire regions ended up growing crops that were genetically similar, almost clones, and when disaster struck, a new strain of rust, a severe drought, a cold snap, it didn't just affect one field, it affected all of them. There were a few bright spots. Some monasteries and larger estates practiced more careful seed management. They maintained separate seed stocks, rotated which fields provided seed, and occasionally imported seed from distant regions to introduce new genetics. This helped, but it was rare. Most peasants didn't have the resources or knowledge to do this. They just saved what they could and hoped for the best. And then there's the issue of what was being selected for. Medieval farmers selected for traits they could see and measure: height, grain size, yield, but they couldn't see root depth, nutrient efficiency, or immune response. They couldn't measure a plant's ability to form beneficial relationships with soil fungi. They couldn't detect subtle differences in how plants responded to stress, So they optimized for the obvious and accidentally weakened the invisible. Root systems are a perfect example. A plant with deep, extensive roots can access water and nutrients from deeper in the soil. It's more drought tolerant, more stable in wind, and better able to anchor itself. But deep roots take energy to grow, energy that could otherwise go into producing grain. So if you're selecting purely for yield, you might inadvertently select for shallower roots. The plants produce more grain in good years, but in bad years, when water is scarce, they fail catastrophically. The same logic applies to disease resistance. A plant's immune system, if we can call it that, is complex. It involves chemical defenses, physical barriers like thicker cell walls, and signaling pathways that detect and respond to pathogens. All of this costs energy. A plant that invests heavily in defense might produce slightly less grain. So if you're selecting purely for yield, you might be selecting against defense. Your plants look better until a disease shows up. Then they all die. Medieval farmers were also losing wild genetic diversity. Before agriculture, the ancestors of wheat, barley, and rye grew wild across Europe and the Near East. These wild populations were incredibly diverse, adapted to different climates, soils, and pests. When early farmers domesticated these plants, they brought that diversity with them. But over time, as wild populations were cleared for farmland, that reservoir of genes disappeared. Wild relatives of crops are crucial for long-term agricultural resilience. They contain genes that domesticated crops have lost, genes for drought tolerance, pest resistance, adaptability. Modern plant breeders actively seek out wild relatives to introduce these traits back into crops, but medieval farmers didn't have that option. The wild relatives were already gone, cleared along with the forests and wetlands. The genetic library had been burned, and they didn't even know it. There's also the issue of seed storage. Medieval farmers stored seed in sacks, barrels, or stone granaries, but storage conditions were far from ideal. Moisture could get in, leading to mold. Insects could infest the seed. Rodents could eat it. And because there was no understanding of seed viability, farmers sometimes planted old, weakened seed that had low germination rates. Fields ended up patchy, with sparse plants that competed poorly with weeds. Poor germination also meant fewer plants to select from. If only half your seed germinates, you're already starting with a smaller population. And a smaller population means less genetic diversity, more chance of inbreeding, and greater vulnerability to random bad luck. It's a downward spiral, and medieval agriculture was caught in it. Some crops fared better than others. Rye, for example, is naturally more genetically diverse than wheat. It's also more tolerant of poor soil and cold weather. So even with crude selective breeding, rye maintained some resilience. But wheat, especially the varieties grown in southern Europe, became increasingly fragile. They needed good soil, stable weather, and freedom from pests to thrive. When conditions were perfect, they produced well. When conditions weren't, they failed spectacularly. So medieval farmers were stuck in a paradox. Their efforts to improve their crops were, in the long term, weakening them. They were creating agricultural systems that worked beautifully under ideal conditions but collapsed under stress. And stress, as we've seen, was constant. Bad weather, poor soil, pests, diseases, all of it hammered crops that were already genetically fragile. The plants themselves had no agency in this process. They couldn't choose to maintain diversity, they couldn't refuse to be selected. They just grew, reproduced, and passed on whatever genes their human caretakers allowed them to pass on. And those genes, narrowed and weakened by generations of well-meaning but misguided selection, left them vulnerable in ways no one could see until it was too late. But not all plants were being bred for food. Some were being grown for an entirely different purpose. And those plants, subjected to relentless industrial demands, were about to discover that being useful to humans was its own kind of curse. Not every plant in medieval Europe was grown to be eaten. Some were grown to be worn, to be walked on, to be tied, woven, and worked until their fibers gave out. These were the utility plants, the ones that kept medieval society clothed, sheltered, and connected. Flax for linen, hemp for rope, and both of them, like every other plant in this era, were being worked to death. Let's start with flax, Linum usitatissimum. The name alone tells you something. Usitatissimum means most useful, and flax earned that title. Its fibers, hidden inside the stems, are strong, smooth, and incredibly versatile. When processed correctly, they become linen, one of the most important textiles in the medieval world. Linen wasn't a luxury. It was essential. Peasants wore it, nobles wore it. It was used for undergarments, shirts, bedding, tablecloths, and even bandages. If you lived in medieval Europe, you were surrounded by linen. But turning flax into linen was brutal for both the plant and the people processing it. First, you had to grow it. Flax is a delicate crop. It needs well-drained, fertile soil and consistent moisture. It doesn't tolerate drought well, and it's sensitive to nutrient depletion. Remember all that talk about exhausted medieval soil? Flax made it worse. It's a heavy feeder, pulling nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium out of the ground. After a season of flax, the soil was even more depleted than before. And flax was grown densely. To produce long, fine fibers, the plants had to be crowded together so they'd grow tall and straight, reaching for sunlight. This dense planting meant competition for nutrients and water was fierce. Weak plants died, strong plants survived, but barely. And because flax was often grown in the same fields year after year, the soil never recovered. Yields dropped. Plants grew shorter, thinner, weaker. But demand didn't drop. Everyone needed linen. So farmers kept planting, kept harvesting, kept draining the soil. Once harvested, the real work began. Flax stems had to be retted, a process where you soak them in water to break down the pectin that binds the fibers to the woody core. Retting could take weeks. The stems were submerged in ponds, rivers, or specially dug pits where bacteria worked to decompose the non-fiber parts of the plant. The smell was legendary. Rotting flax stinks. It's a sharp, organic reek that clings to everything. Entire villages knew when retting was happening. After retting, the stems were dried, then beaten to break up the woody core. This was called scutching, and it was hard, repetitive labor. You'd pound the stems with wooden tools until the outer layers shattered and fell away, leaving only the fibers. Then came hackling, combing the fibers through progressively finer sets of metal teeth to separate and align them. Only then could the fibers be spun into thread. The entire process, from seed to thread, was labor-intensive and time-consuming. It took roughly 10 to 12 pounds of flax stems to produce 1 pound of usable fiber, and a single shirt required about 2 pounds of fiber. So to clothe a family, you needed to grow, process, and spin enormous amounts of flax every year, without fail. And what did the plant get out of this? Nothing. Flax grown for fiber was harvested before it could produce mature seeds. The plants never reproduced naturally. They existed solely to serve human needs, generation after generation, pulled from the ground and processed before they ever had a chance to complete their life cycle. Then there's hemp, cannabis sativa. No, not that kind of cannabis. The medieval variety was bred for fiber, not psychoactive compounds. Hemp was tougher, coarser, and stronger than flax. It was used for rope, sails, sacks, and heavy-duty textiles. If flax was the fabric of daily life, hemp was the infrastructure. Ships couldn't sail without hemp rigging. Carts couldn't haul without hemp rope. Grain couldn't be stored without hemp sacks. Hemp was easier to grow than flax, at least in some ways. It tolerated poorer soil and required less water. But it still depleted nutrients, especially nitrogen. And it grew tall, sometimes over 10 feet, which meant it cast deep shade and suppressed other plants. Fields planted with hemp became monocultures. Nothing else could compete. Harvesting hemp was backbreaking. The stalks were thick and fibrous, difficult to cut by hand. Once cut, they had to be retted, just like flax. The fibers inside the stalks were bound tightly to the woody core, and separating them required soaking, drying, and beating. Hemp retting took even longer than flax, sometimes months, and the smell was even worse. The fibers, once extracted, were coarse and rough. They couldn't be used for clothing without extensive processing, so they were reserved for industrial uses. But here's the thing. Hemp and flax weren't just crops. They were economic engines. Entire regions specialized in growing them. Flanders, parts of modern-day Belgium, became famous for linen production. The Baltic region exported vast quantities of hemp for shipbuilding. These weren't subsistence crops. They were cash crops, grown for trade, and that meant they were subject to market pressures. When demand was high, farmers planted more. When prices rose, landowners converted food-producing fields into fiber-producing fields. And when a bad harvest hit, when the flax failed or the hemp rotted in the rain, communities that had gambled on fiber instead of food faced starvation. You can't eat linen, you can't survive on rope, but you could sell them if the market held. And often, it didn't. The ecological cost of fiber crops was significant. They depleted soil faster than grain crops. They required large amounts of water for retting, which polluted rivers and ponds. The bacteria that broke down the plant material consumed oxygen, creating dead zones where fish and other aquatic life couldn't survive. Downstream communities complained about the smell and the fouled water, but there was little they could do. Linen and hemp were too valuable. And the plants themselves, like the food crops, were being selectively bred for specific traits. Longer fibers, stronger stems, faster growth. But again, this came at a cost. Genetic diversity declined. Regional varieties, adapted to local soils and climates, were replaced by standardized strains optimized for fiber production. And when those strains encountered a new pest or disease, entire harvests could fail. Flax rust, caused by the fungus Melampsora linni, was a persistent problem. It appeared as orange pustules on leaves and stems, weakening the plant and reducing fiber quality. Infected flax produced shorter, weaker fibers that broke easily during processing. Hemp faced its own diseases, including various molds and blights that attacked stems and roots. And because these crops were grown in dense stands, once disease appeared, it spread quickly. There were no disease-resistant varieties, no crop rotations sophisticated enough to break pest cycles. Farmers just planted, hoped, and dealt with whatever happened. If the harvest was good, they processed it and sold it. If it wasn't, they went into debt or starved. And the labor didn't stop at the field. Processing fiber crops required infrastructure, retting ponds, drying sheds, scutching and hackling tools, spinning wheels and looms. All of this required wood, which we've already established was in short supply. Building a retting pond meant digging, lining, and maintaining it. Building a scutching barn meant felling trees and shaping timbers. Every step in the process consumed resources and labor. Women and children did most of the processing work. Spinning flax into thread was considered women's work, endless, repetitive, and poorly paid. The term spinster originally meant a woman who spun thread, and it became synonymous with unmarried women because spinning was one of the few ways they could earn money. Girls learned to spin as soon as their hands were strong enough to hold the tools. They spun during every spare moment, walking to market, sitting by the fire, waiting for water to boil. So flax and hemp weren't just being cultivated, they were being industrialized in a pre-industrial way. They were grown, harvested, processed, and traded on a scale that strained both the plants and the people involved. And like every other plant in medieval Europe, they had no choice. They grew where they were planted, they died when they were cut, and they served human needs until there was nothing left to give. But while peasants and craftspeople depended on these working plants, there was another class of vegetation that lived a very different life. Plants grown not for survival, but for beauty. And in a world of scarcity and struggle, beauty was a luxury only the powerful could afford. In the middle of all this death and depletion, in a world where most plants existed only to be consumed, burned, or worked to exhaustion, there were gardens. Small, enclosed, carefully tended spaces where plants were allowed to be beautiful, not useful, not edible, just beautiful. But don't mistake this for mercy, because even in these gardens, survival depended entirely on privilege, and the plants that grew there were just as trapped as any crop in a field. Medieval ornamental gardens were rare. Most people never saw one. If you were a peasant, your relationship with plants was purely utilitarian. You grew what you could eat or sell, you gathered what you could use. The idea of dedicating land, labor, and resources to flowers was absurd. But if you were nobility or part of a monastery, gardens became symbols of power, piety, and control over nature itself. Monastic gardens were the most common. Monasteries had the land, the labor, and the theological justification. These gardens were often divided into sections. The kitchen garden grew vegetables and herbs for cooking. The physic garden grew medicinal plants. And then, usually near the church or cloister, there was the ornamental garden, a place of contemplation, prayer, and beauty. Roses, lilies, violets, and other flowering plants were arranged in geometric patterns, often around a central fountain or well. These gardens weren't wild. They were controlled, symmetrical, and deeply symbolic. Every plant had meaning. The rose represented the Virgin Mary. The lily symbolized purity. Violets meant humility. The garden itself was meant to evoke paradise, a glimpse of Eden in a fallen world. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also propaganda, a visual reminder that the church could create order, beauty, and holiness in a world of chaos. Roses, Rosa species, were the stars of medieval gardens. They'd been cultivated for thousands of years, but medieval varieties were simpler than modern hybrids. Most were what we'd now call species roses, or old garden roses. They bloomed once per year, usually in early summer, with 5-petaled flowers in shades of white, pink, or red. The scent was intense, sweet, and fleeting, and then they were gone, replaced by hips, the fruit of the rose, which was sometimes used in medicine or food. Growing roses in a medieval garden wasn't easy. They needed good soil, which, as we've established, was in short supply. They needed pruning, watering, and protection from pests. Aphids loved roses, so did beetles, caterpillars, and fungal diseases like black spot and powdery mildew. Keeping a rosebush healthy required constant attention, which meant labor, and labor, in the Middle Ages, meant either doing it yourself or having someone else do it for you. Monasteries had lay brothers and servants. Nobles had gardeners. Peasants had neither. Lilies, particularly the Madonna lily, Lilium candidum, were another prized ornamental, pure white, fragrant, and tall. They symbolized the Virgin Mary and were often planted near churches. But lilies are picky. They need well-drained soil, consistent moisture, and protection from slugs which will devour the bulbs if given a chance. They also take years to establish. You plant a bulb, and it might not bloom for 2 or 3 seasons. That kind of patience required stability, something most medieval people didn't have. Violets, viola species, were humbler but no less symbolic. They grew low to the ground, often in shade, with small purple or white flowers. They represented humility and modesty, virtues prized by the church. Violets were easier to grow than roses or lilies, but they were still cultivated plants, not wild weeds. Someone had to tend them, divide them, keep them from being overrun by more aggressive species. And that's the key point. These gardens were maintained, weeds were pulled, paths were swept, hedges were trimmed. The plants that grew there were chosen, arranged, and controlled. Wild plants, the ones that showed up uninvited, were removed. They disrupted the symmetry, the symbolism, the illusion of paradise. So even in these gardens, where plants were supposedly valued for their beauty, there was no freedom. Only the chosen survived. Noble gardens were even more exclusive. Kings, queens, and wealthy lords created elaborate pleasure gardens, often attached to castles or manor houses. These gardens featured not just flowers, but also fountains, statuary, and carefully manicured lawns. Some included menageries, small zoos where exotic animals were kept as living trophies. The gardens themselves were statements of wealth and power. They said, "I control nature. I can make beauty where I choose." But these gardens were tiny. Even the largest covered only a few acres, and they existed in stark contrast to the surrounding landscape. Beyond the garden walls, forests were being cleared, fields were failing, wild plants were struggling. But inside the walls, roses bloomed, lilies stood tall, and everything was perfect, at least as long as the gardeners kept working. And the work was relentless. Medieval gardens had no modern tools, no hoses, no fertilizers beyond manure, no pesticides. Everything was done by hand. Watering meant hauling buckets from a well or stream. Weeding meant kneeling in the dirt, pulling each unwanted plant individually. Pruning meant using shears or knives, carefully shaping each bush and tree. It was meditative, perhaps, but also exhausting. The irony is brutal. These gardens, symbols of peace and beauty, required constant violence. Violence against weeds, violence against pests, violence against any plant that didn't fit the design, and the plants that were allowed to stay lived under surveillance. They were watched, judged, and removed the moment they stopped being beautiful. A rose that didn't bloom was pulled out. A lily that grew crooked was discarded. There was no room for imperfection. Outside the walls, wild beauty persisted, but no one cared. Wildflowers bloomed in meadows, forests, and along roadsides, but they weren't celebrated. They were background noise, invisible unless they were useful. Daisies, buttercups, campion, clover, all of them grew freely without human intervention. They adapted to poor soil, grazing animals, and changing weather. They didn't need gardeners, they just needed to be left alone. But being left alone was becoming increasingly rare. As fields expanded and forests shrank, even wild spaces were being trampled, grazed, and ploughed. Meadows that had once burst with colour were converted to pasture or cropland. Hedgerows, which were biodiversity hotspots, were cleared to make fields larger and easier to plough. The wild plants that had thrived in the margins were losing their margins. And the plants in the gardens, privileged as they seemed, were no safer. They depended entirely on human care. If a monastery was abandoned, the garden died. If a noble family fell from power, the garden was neglected, overrun, and eventually disappeared. These plants had no wild relatives to fall back on. Many had been cultivated for so long that they couldn't survive without human intervention. Their seeds needed specific conditions to germinate. Their roots needed enriched soil. They were as dependent on humans as humans were on wheat and barley. There were also herb gardens, which blurred the line between ornamental and practical. Lavender, sage, thyme, rosemary, all were grown for their scent, their medicinal properties, and their symbolic meaning. These gardens were more common than purely ornamental ones because they served multiple purposes, but they still required land, labor, and resources that most people didn't have. So yes, there were gardens in the Middle Ages. There was beauty, but it was fragile, exclusive, and always on the edge of collapse. It existed only where power and wealth allowed it. Outside those walls, the botanical world was in crisis. And, inside, the plants that were allowed to flourish did so only as long as they pleased their human masters. But even as some plants were pampered in gardens, others were being hunted across continents. Because medieval Europe didn't just exploit its own plants. It reached outward, across seas and deserts, chasing flavors that didn't grow at home. And those plants, thousands of miles away, were about to feel the weight of European hunger. Medieval Europeans were obsessed with spices, not because they loved cooking, though they did enjoy flavor. Not because spices were nutritious, though some had medicinal properties. They wanted spices because spices were rare, exotic, and outrageously expensive. Owning spices meant you had money. Serving spice food meant you had power. And the plants that produced those spices, growing thousands of miles away in Asia and Africa, were about to become the most valuable commodities on Earth, which meant they were about to be exploited on a scale Europe's own plants could barely imagine. Let's start with black pepper, Piper nigrum. Today, it's so common you probably have a shaker of it on your table. But in medieval Europe, pepper was worth its weight in silver. Sometimes, literally, peppercorns were used as currency. They were given as dowries, paid as taxes, and hoarded like treasure. A pound of pepper could buy a sheep. A sack of pepper could buy land. And all of it came from a single region, the Malabar coast of India. Black pepper grows on a climbing vine. It needs tropical heat, high humidity, and consistent rainfall, none of which existed in Europe. So, medieval Europeans had no choice. They had to import it through a chain of middlemen so long and complex that by the time pepper reached European markets, its price had multiplied 100-fold. Arab traders controlled the overland routes. Venetian merchants controlled Mediterranean shipping. Everyone took a cut. And the pepper vines themselves, growing in carefully managed plantations in India, had no idea they were the center of a global economy. But here's what medieval Europeans didn't see: the environmental cost of pepper cultivation. Pepper vines were grown in monocultures, dense plantations where every plant was the same species, often the same variety. This made them vulnerable to pests and diseases, just like European wheat. It also meant clearing forests to make room for more vines. As demand increased, more land was converted. Wild ecosystems were replaced by orderly rows of pepper. Then there's cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, the inner bark of a tree native to Sri Lanka. To harvest cinnamon, you had to cut branches, strip the bark, and let it dry into the rolled quills we recognize today. It was labor-intensive, and the trees had to be carefully managed. Cut too much, and the tree died. Cut too little, and you didn't meet demand, and demand was insane. Cinnamon was used in food, medicine, perfume, and religious rituals. It was one of the most sought-after spices in medieval Europe. But cinnamon trees didn't grow just anywhere. They needed specific conditions: tropical heat, monsoon rains, and the right soil. For centuries, Arab and later European traders kept the source of cinnamon a closely guarded secret. They spread myths about cinnamon growing in valleys, guarded by giant birds, or being harvested from the nests of mythical creatures. Why? Because secrecy meant monopoly, and monopoly meant profit. When the Portuguese finally reached Sri Lanka in the early 1500s, they took control of the cinnamon trade by force. They enslaved local workers, forced them to harvest cinnamon under brutal conditions, and destroyed competing plantations to maintain prices. The cinnamon trees, which had grown for centuries in relative balance with their environment, were suddenly subjected to industrial-scale extraction. Cloves, Syzygium aromaticum, came from even farther away, the Maluku Islands in modern-day Indonesia. Cloves are the dried flower buds of a tropical tree, and they were so valuable in medieval Europe that wars were fought over them. A single pound of cloves could cost a year's wages for a laborer, and just like pepper and cinnamon, cloves grew only in a tiny geographic area. You couldn't transplant them. You couldn't grow them in Europe. You could only import them at whatever price the middlemen demanded. The clove trees themselves were under pressure. As European demand exploded, local rulers increased production. More trees were planted, but in monocultures. Forests were cleared to make room. And because clove trees take years to mature, there was constant tension between immediate profit and long-term sustainability. When European powers eventually colonized the region, they imposed quotas, destroyed excess trees to keep prices high, and turned clove cultivation into a colonial industry. The trees went from being part of a diverse ecosystem to being a cash crop controlled by distant empires. Nutmeg and mace, both from the same tree, Myristica fragrans, followed a similar pattern. Native to the Banda Islands, also in Indonesia, nutmeg was so valuable that the Dutch eventually committed genocide to control its production. They killed or enslaved the indigenous population, burned nutmeg trees that weren't under their control, and established plantations worked by enslaved laborers. The trees, which had coexisted with humans for centuries, became tools of empire. And here's the thing, none of these plants asked to be valuable. Pepper didn't evolve its pungent alkaloid piperine to please European palates. It evolved it as a defense mechanism against insects and fungi. Cinnamon's aromatic bark protects the tree from pests. Cloves' intense flavor comes from eugenol, a compound that deters herbivores. These plants developed their chemistry over millions of years to survive in their ecosystems, and then humans decided that chemistry was delicious, and everything changed. Medieval Europeans didn't see the plantations. They didn't see the forests cleared, the monocultures planted, the workers exploited. They just saw jars of exotic powder that made their food taste better and proved they were wealthy. They had no concept of ecological cost or sustainability. They didn't think about what happened to the plants or the people who grew them. They just wanted more. And the demand kept growing. Spices were used in everything. Food, yes, but also medicine. Cloves were chewed to freshen breath and numb toothaches. Cinnamon was believed to cure colds and aid digestion. Pepper was thought to balance the body's humours. Whether these uses were effective is beside the point. People believed they worked, and so they bought them. Spices were also status symbols. A nobleman who served spiced wine at a banquet was showing off. A merchant who could afford pepper in his stew was climbing the social ladder. The plants themselves became currencies of prestige, traded and hoarded, not just for their utility, but for what they represented: access, wealth, and connection to a wider world. This obsession with spices set the stage for the age of exploration. When European powers couldn't get enough spices through existing trade routes, they started looking for new ones. So, they sailed around Africa, across the Atlantic, into the unknown. And when they found new lands, they didn't just trade, they conquered. They colonized. They imposed plantation agriculture on a global scale. And the plants, whether in Asia, Africa, or eventually the Americas, were forced into service. The spice trade was one of the first examples of botanical imperialism. It wasn't just about controlling land or people. It was about controlling plants. Whoever controlled the plants controlled the market, and whoever controlled the market controlled wealth. The plants themselves became strategic resources, fought over, hoarded, and exploited without mercy. Medieval Europeans didn't destroy their own ecosystems just because they were short-sighted. They destroyed ecosystems around the world because they wanted things those ecosystems produced. And they were willing to travel thousands of miles, wage wars, and upend entire societies to get them. The plants that produced pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg weren't just harvested. They were weaponized, turned into tools of empire and profit. So while European forests were being cleared for farmland and firewood, tropical forests halfway around the world were being cleared for spice plantations. While European crops were struggling in depleted soil, tropical crops were being forced into monocultures that would eventually face the same problems. The Middle Ages weren't just a dark time for European plants. They were the beginning of a global pattern of exploitation that would reshape every continent. But back in Europe, not every plant was suffering, because while crops failed and forests fell, there was one group of plants that thrived in the chaos. The survivors, the opportunists, the ones nobody wanted but couldn't kill. While wheat struggled and forests disappeared, while roses were pampered in walled gardens and spices were hunted across oceans, there was another category of plant life, quietly, stubbornly, thriving. These weren't the plants anyone wanted. They weren't cultivated, celebrated, or traded. They were weeds. And in the chaos of medieval Europe, weeds didn't just survive. They flourished. Let's define what we mean by a weed. Botanically, there's no such thing. A weed is just a plant growing where humans don't want it. But ecologically, weeds are specialists in disturbance. They're the plants that move into broken ground, trampled soil, abandoned fields. They germinate fast, grow quickly, and produce massive amounts of seed. They don't need rich soil or careful tending. They just need an opportunity. And medieval Europe was one long, continuous opportunity. Take the common dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. Today, it's the enemy of suburban lawns. But in the Middle Ages, it was everywhere, and no one cared. Dandelions are nearly indestructible. They have deep taproots that can penetrate compacted soil and access water far below the surface. If you cut the plant at ground level, the root survives and sends up new leaves. If you try to dig it out and leave even a small piece of root behind, it regrows. And each plant produces hundreds of seeds, each one attached to a fluffy parachute that can travel miles on the wind. Dandelions thrive in disturbed soil, which medieval Europe had in abundance. Ploughed fields, trampled pastures, roadsides, ruins, anywhere the ground had been broken, dandelions moved in. They weren't competing with ancient forests or diverse meadows. Those were already gone. They were competing with other weeds, and they were good at it. Fast growth, deep roots, prolific seed production, all the traits that make a successful weed. And here's the interesting part. Dandelions are edible. The leaves are bitter but nutritious, high in vitamins A and C. The roots can be roasted and used as a coffee substitute. The flowers can be made into wine. Medieval people did eat dandelions, especially in early spring when other greens weren't available yet. But they didn't cultivate them. They didn't need to. Dandelions grew without help, in places where nothing else would. Nettles, Urtica dioica, are another weed that thrive. They're covered in tiny hairs that inject a cocktail of irritating chemicals when you touch them. Histamine, acetylcholine, serotonin. It's a defense mechanism, and it works. Most animals avoid nettles, but humans, being stubborn, found ways to use them. Young nettle leaves, harvested carefully with gloves, can be cooked and eaten. The fibers in the stems can be processed like flax, though the quality is lower. And nettles indicate rich soil, high in nitrogen, often near old settlements or animal pens. Nettles spread through rhizomes, underground stems that send up new shoots. Once established, a nettle patch is nearly impossible to remove. Cut the plants down, and they regrow from the roots. Dig them up, and any fragment left behind becomes a new plant. They thrive in disturbed ground, hedgerows, forest edges, anywhere humans have altered the landscape. And in medieval Europe, that was nearly everywhere. Thistles, various species in the Asteraceae family, are another group of successful weeds. They're prickly, aggressive, and deeply unpopular, but they're also tough. Thistles have deep taproots, sometimes extending several feet into the ground. They can survive drought, poor soil, and heavy grazing. Their seeds are wind-dispersed, like dandelions, and they produce them in enormous quantities. A single thistle plant can produce thousands of seeds in a season. Medieval farmers hated thistles. They invaded pastures, competing with grass and injuring livestock that tried to eat them. They spread into fields, reducing crop yields, but removing them was nearly impossible with medieval tools. You'd have to dig deep to get the entire root, and that was exhausting, back-breaking work. So thistles persisted, thriving in the margins, waiting for the next abandoned field or overgrazed pasture. Plantain, Plantago species, is less dramatic but just as successful. It's a low-growing plant with broad leaves and tall, thin flower spikes. It grows in compacted soil, places where other plants struggle. Paths, roadsides, village commons, anywhere feet or hooves press the earth down, plantain moves in. It's sometimes called white man's footprint because it followed European colonists around the world, sprouting wherever they walked. Plantain has medicinal uses. The leaves can be applied to wounds to stop bleeding and reduce inflammation. Medieval herbalists knew this, but they didn't cultivate plantain. It grew everywhere, unbidden, just waiting to be harvested. And because it tolerated trampling better than almost any other plant, it persisted even in the most disturbed environments. Then there's clover, Trifolium species. Clover is technically a legume, which means it has a superpower. It can fix nitrogen from the air. In its roots, live bacteria called rhizobia, which convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form plants can use. When clover grows, it enriches the soil, and when it dies, it leaves behind nitrogen that other plants can access. This makes clover incredibly valuable, though medieval farmers didn't fully understand why. Clover grew in pastures, meadows, and field margins. It wasn't planted intentionally, not in the Middle Ages, but it was tolerated because livestock loved it. Cows, sheep, and horses grazed on clover happily, and the fields where clover grew seemed healthier. Crops planted after clover-rich pasture did better than crops planted in exhausted fields. No one knew about nitrogen fixation, but they could see the results. What all these weeds have in common is resilience. They don't need perfect conditions. They don't need human care. They've evolved to exploit disturbance, to thrive in the gaps left by destruction. And medieval Europe was full of gaps. Every cleared forest left disturbed soil. Every abandoned field became a weed haven. Every roadside, every ruin, every overgrazed pasture was colonized by plants that could handle the chaos. While cultivated crops were pampered and still failing, while ornamental flowers were locked behind walls, weeds spread freely. They were the botanical underclass, despised and ignored, but they were winning. They weren't beautiful. They weren't valuable. They were but they were everywhere. And they asked for nothing. There's a lesson in that. The plants humans valued most, wheat, roses, spices, were fragile. They needed specific conditions, constant care, and still they struggled. But the plants humans despised, dandelions, nettles, thistles, were thriving. They didn't need rich soil or gentle weather. They didn't need protection from pests. They just needed to be left alone, which ironically, they never were. Farmers spent countless hours trying to eradicate weeds, and the weeds came back stronger every time. From an ecological perspective, weeds are pioneers. They're the first plants to colonize disturbed land, stabilizing soil, preventing erosion, and creating conditions for other species to follow. In a healthy ecosystem, weeds are temporary. They move in, do their job, and are eventually replaced by more stable plant communities. But in medieval Europe, the disturbance never stopped. Fields were plowed every year, forests were cleared continuously, pastures were overgrazed. The land was stuck in a permanent state of disruption, and so the weeds never left. And while humans saw weeds as enemies, other species saw them as lifelines. Insects that had lost their forest habitats found food and shelter in nettle patches and thistle stands. Birds that had depended on woodland seeds now ate weed seeds. Rabbits, mice, and other small mammals hid in dense weed growth. The weeds, despised and unwanted, became the scaffolding for what little biodiversity remained. So yes, weeds thrived in the Middle Ages, not because conditions were good, but because they were bad. Weeds are proof that life persists, even in chaos. They're the botanical equivalent of survivors, scarred, stubborn, and impossible to kill. They didn't need glory. They didn't need recognition. They just needed ground, and ground was the one thing medieval Europe had in abundance, broken, depleted, and waiting to be reclaimed. But even as weeds persisted and crops struggled, the medieval world was beginning to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, new ideas were taking root. Ideas that would eventually transform how humans understood plants, medicine, and the natural world itself. By the 15th century, something was shifting. The Middle Ages were ending, though no one alive at the time would have called it that. They didn't know they were medieval. They just knew the world was changing. Trade routes were expanding, cities were growing, and slowly, hesitantly, a new way of thinking about the natural world was beginning to emerge. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to plant seeds that would eventually grow into the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and a fundamentally different relationship with plants. Let's start with the people who never stopped paying attention, the herbalists. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were individuals, mostly women, some monks, a few physicians, who studied plants not just as commodities but as living systems. They observed which plants grew where, which ones healed, which ailments, which ones were poisonous, and in what doses. This knowledge was passed down orally, mother to daughter, master to apprentice, written in scattered manuscripts that few could read. One of the most remarkable was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess who lived in what is now Germany. Hildegard was a polymath, composer, mystic, theologian, and naturalist. She wrote extensively about plants, documenting their medicinal properties in a work called Physica. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she didn't just repeat ancient authorities. She observed, she experimented, she recorded what worked and what didn't. Hildegard described hundreds of plants, from common herbs like fennel and sage to more exotic imports. She noted their habitats, their growing seasons, their uses in treating everything from headaches to digestive complaints. Her work wasn't perfect. She mixed observation with theology, attributing healing properties to divine will as much as to chemistry. But she was documenting, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. By the 15th century, more people were writing about plants. Herbals, illustrated manuscripts describing medicinal plants, began to circulate more widely. These weren't scientific texts in the modern sense. They were practical guides, meant to help apothecaries, physicians, and anyone else who needed to identify and use healing herbs. The illustrations were often crude, sometimes wildly inaccurate, but they represented an attempt to standardize knowledge. And then, in the mid-15th century, everything changed. Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press around 1450. For the first time in history, books could be mass-produced, ideas could spread faster than ever before, and one of the first types of books to be printed were herbals. Suddenly, knowledge that had been locked in monasteries or passed down orally was available to anyone who could read or afford a book. This had profound implications for botany. Before printing, if you wanted to learn about plants, you needed access to a manuscript, which was rare and expensive. Or you needed a teacher, which meant traveling to a monastery or university. But printed herbals could be copied and distributed. A physician in Spain could learn about the same plants as a monk in England. Errors could be corrected in new editions. Illustrations could be refined. Knowledge became cumulative. The Renaissance also brought a renewed interest in classical texts. Ancient Greek and Roman works on plants by authors like Dioscorides and Pliny the Elder were translated and studied. Dioscorides, a first-century Greek physician, had written De Materia Medica, a comprehensive guide to medicinal plants that had been copied by hand for over 1,000 years. Now it was printed, illustrated, and widely read. It became the foundation for Renaissance botany. But the Renaissance didn't just look backward, it also looked outward. European exploration was accelerating. Portuguese sailors rounded the Cape of Good Hope, reaching India by sea. Spanish explorers crossed the Atlantic and encountered the Americas. And everywhere they went, they found plants. New plants, plants Europe had never seen. Tomatoes, potatoes, maize, cacao, tobacco, all of them strange, exotic, and potentially valuable. These new plants were brought back to Europe, sometimes as curiosities, sometimes as potential crops. And for the first time, Europeans began to realize how vast and diverse the botanical world truly was. The plants they knew, wheat, roses, oak, were just a tiny fraction of what existed. There were entire continents full of species they'd never imagined. And this realization, slowly, began to change how they thought about plants. Botanical gardens started appearing in the 16th century, first in Italy, then spreading across Europe. These weren't ornamental gardens. They were research institutions, places where plants could be studied, classified, and grown experimentally. The first was established in Pisa in 1544, followed quickly by gardens in Padua, Bologna, and elsewhere. Universities began teaching botany as a formal discipline, separate from medicine. These gardens collected plants from around the world. They tried to grow tropical species in temperate climates. They experimented with cultivation techniques. They began to ask questions not just about what plants were useful for, but about how plants worked. How did they grow? How did they reproduce? Why did some thrive in certain soils and fail in others? These were the beginnings of botany as a science. The invention of better tools helped. Magnifying lenses allowed closer examination of plant structures. Artists became more skilled at botanical illustration, producing images that were scientifically accurate as well as beautiful. Herbals evolved from practical guides into scientific references. The plants themselves became objects of study, not just resources to be exploited. But let's not romanticize this too much. The Renaissance fascination with plants was still deeply tied to utility and profit. Botanical gardens weren't just about knowledge. They were about finding new crops, new medicines, new commodities. The exploration that brought new plants to Europe also brought colonization, slavery, and environmental destruction on an unprecedented scale. The same ships that carried tomato seeds also carried conquistadors. And back in the European countryside, most of this meant nothing. Peasants still ploughed exhausted fields. Forests were still being cleared. Weeds still thrived in the margins. The lives of actual plants, the ones growing in soil, struggling against pests and weather, hadn't changed. What had changed was that a small group of people, scholars, physicians, wealthy collectors, were starting to see plants differently. Not just as resources, but as subjects worthy of study. This shift would take centuries to fully develop. The medieval attitude that plants existed for human use and nothing more would persist for a long time, but the seeds of a different perspective were being planted. The idea that plants had their own biology, their own life cycles, their own complexity, independent of human needs, was beginning to take root. By the late 1500s, naturalists were starting to classify plants systematically, grouping them by shared characteristics rather than just by use. They noticed that some plants seemed related, with similar flowers or leaf structures. They began to ask why. This would eventually lead to taxonomy, ecology, and evolutionary biology. But in the Renaissance, it was just observation. Careful, detailed, increasingly rigorous observation. The printing press meant these observations could be shared. A botanist in Germany could read about plants growing in Italy. A physician in England could learn about remedies from the Ottoman Empire. Knowledge was no longer locked in isolated pockets. It was becoming networked, collaborative, cumulative, and plants, for the first time in history, were being studied not just individually, but comparatively. How did oak differ from beech? Why did roses have thorns? What made wheat different from rye at a structural level? These questions sound simple now, but they represented a profound shift. For 1,000 years, plants had been seen through a lens of use, theology, and tradition. Now, slowly, they were being seen through a lens of curiosity. Not just, what can this plant do for me? But what is this plant? It was the beginning of botany as we know it. And while it wouldn't save the forests or restore the soil or protect the wild plants still struggling in a human-dominated landscape, it would eventually lead to a deeper understanding of how fragile and interconnected plant life truly is. But that understanding was still centuries away. In the 15th century, the damage was done. The forests were gone. The soil was exhausted. The plants that had survived the Middle Ages, whether wheat in a field, weeds on a roadside, or spices in a distant plantation, had been shaped by human needs, human greed, and human ignorance. And as the Renaissance bloomed, the botanical world was still recovering from 1,000 years of medieval darkness. So here we are, 1,000 years, 5 centuries of slow collapse, 5 centuries of gradual recovery, and through it all, plants endured. Not because they were strong, though some were. Not because they were valued, though a few were. They endured because that's what plants do. They root, they grow, they adapt. And when they can't adapt, they vanish, leaving no monuments, no chronicles, just empty spaces where forests used to stand. The story of plants in the Middle Ages is a story of silence. Not the peaceful silence of a forest at dawn, but the silence of things that can't speak, can't run, can't protest. They stood in place while axes fell and fires burned. They struggled in depleted soil while farmers prayed for better harvests. They were harvested, processed, and consumed without ceremony or gratitude. And when they disappeared, no one noticed. Not right away. Not until it was too late. Medieval people saw plants as resources, and that's understandable. Survival was hard. Life was short. When you're struggling to feed your family, to stay warm through winter, to recover from illness, you don't have the luxury of thinking about ecosystems or biodiversity. You use what you can. You take what you need. And if it runs out, you find something else or you die. That was the medieval reality. But the consequences of that reality echo forward. The forests that were cleared in the Middle Ages never fully returned. Old-growth ecosystems, the kind that take thousands of years to develop, were replaced by managed woodlands, agricultural land, or nothing at all. The soil that was depleted took centuries to recover, if it recovered. Some regions are still dealing with erosion and nutrient loss that began in medieval times. The plant species that went extinct, we'll never know how many, are gone forever. And the patterns established in the Middle Ages, seeing nature as a resource to be extracted, forests as obstacles to be cleared, plants as commodities to be traded, those patterns didn't end with the Renaissance. They intensified. The age of exploration turned local exploitation into global exploitation. The Industrial Revolution mechanized it, and today we're still operating under the same basic assumption that the natural world exists for human use. But we've learned things medieval people never knew. We understand soil chemistry, nitrogen cycles, the role of mycorrhizal fungi in plant health. We know about biodiversity, genetic diversity, ecosystem services. We've mapped plant genomes, traced evolutionary relationships, and documented the intricate web of dependencies that connects plants to insects, to fungi, to each other. We know, intellectually at least, that plants aren't just resources. They're the foundation of almost all life on Earth. Photosynthesis, the process that lets plants convert sunlight into chemical energy, is what makes our planet habitable. Plants produce the oxygen we breathe. They stabilize soil, regulate water cycles, moderate climate. They're the base of the food web. Without plants, there are no herbivores. Without herbivores, no predators. Without plants, ecosystems collapse. And without ecosystems, humans don't survive. It's that simple. The Middle Ages taught us, or should have taught us, what happens when you treat plants as infinite. They're not. Forests can be cleared faster than they regrow. Soil can be depleted faster than it forms. Species can go extinct. And once they're gone, they don't come back. Evolution doesn't work on human timescales. You can't just wait a few generations and expect a lost species to re-evolve. Extinction is permanent. Modern agriculture has learned some lessons. Crop rotation is standard. Fertilizers replenish nutrients. We've developed pest-resistant varieties, irrigation systems, and techniques that increase yields without exhausting soil. But we're still making medieval mistakes on a larger scale. We're still clearing forests, this time tropical rainforests, for farmland and cattle pasture. We're still growing monocultures, vast fields of genetically identical crops vulnerable to disease and pests. We're still prioritizing short-term profit over long-term sustainability. And we're seeing the consequences. Pollinators, bees, butterflies, birds are declining because we've eliminated the wild plants they depend on. Soil erosion is a global crisis, with topsoil being lost faster than it's formed. Climate change, driven partly by deforestation and agricultural practices, is shifting growing zones and stressing plant populations. We're in the middle of a sixth mass extinction, and plants are vanishing at rates not seen since the dinosaurs died out. The medieval relationship with plants was destructive, but it was small scale. A cleared forest affected a region. A depleted field affected a village. Today, we're operating at a planetary scale. Decisions made in one country affect ecosystems on other continents. The plants we choose to grow or not grow shape global food security, carbon cycles, and biodiversity. We have more knowledge than medieval people could have dreamed of. But we're still acting as if plants are infinite, as if nature will always provide, as if there are no limits. But there's hope too. Conservation efforts are protecting what remains of wild ecosystems. Seed banks are preserving genetic diversity. Regenerative agriculture is rebuilding soil health. Rewilding projects are restoring forests and wetlands. People are starting to see plants not just as crops or timber, but as partners in a complex, interconnected system we're all part of. The plants that survived the Middle Ages, the weeds, the adaptable species, the ones that thrived in the margins, they're still here. Dandelions still push through cracks in pavement. Nettles still colonize disturbed ground. Oak trees still grow from acorns, slower than human lifetimes, but persistent. Plants are resilient. They've survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and 1,000 years of medieval exploitation. They'll survive us too, if we let them. So, what can we take from the story of medieval plants? Maybe this: that silence isn't consent. Just because plants don't scream when they're cut doesn't mean they're not affected. Just because forests don't fight back doesn't mean they're ours to destroy. And just because a system seems stable doesn't mean it won't collapse if pushed too far. Medieval farmers didn't intend to exhaust their soil. Medieval loggers didn't intend to deforest entire regions. They were just trying to survive. But their cumulative actions, repeated over generations, reshaped the landscape permanently. And we're doing the same thing, with more powerful tools and less excuse. We know better. The question is whether we'll do better. Tonight, as you drift off, think about the plants around you, the trees outside your window, the vegetables in your refrigerator, the weeds pushing through sidewalk cracks. They're not just scenery. They're not just resources. They're living systems with their own evolutionary histories, their own chemical defenses, their own strategies for survival. They've been here far longer than humans, and if we're wise, we'll make sure they're here long after. The Middle Ages were dark for plants, but they weren't the end. Life persists. Forests regrow. Soil heals. But it takes time, patience, and a willingness to see plants as something more than fuel, food, or fiber, as partners, as teachers, as the quiet, essential foundation of everything we are. So before you sleep, maybe take a moment to appreciate the botanical world. The oxygen you're breathing right now was made by a plant. The bed you're lying on probably contains cotton, linen, or wood. The food you ate today started with photosynthesis. We live in a world made possible by plants. And they're still here, still growing, still converting sunlight into life, asking nothing in return except to be allowed to exist. Sleep well, and thank the plants while you're at it. They've been holding this planet together for 400 million years. They survived the Middle Ages. And, with a little care, a little respect, and a willingness to learn from past mistakes, they'll survive us too. So, we've spent the last hour walking through 1,000 years of botanical suffering. We've seen forests fall and soil fail. We've watched crops struggle under the weight of exploitation and climate chaos. We've followed the silent victims of medieval life, the plants that couldn't scream, couldn't run, and couldn't write their own histories. And now, as you're drifting toward sleep, maybe you're thinking, why does any of this matter? Why spend an hour thinking about plants that died centuries ago? Here's why. Because the story of medieval plants isn't just history. It's a warning. It's a mirror. And it's a reminder that the choices we make about the natural world, whether we're conscious of them or not, echo forward in ways we can barely imagine. The forests cleared in the year 1200 didn't just disappear. They changed rainfall patterns, altered soil composition, and shifted entire ecosystems. The effects are still visible today, 800 years later. When you cut down an ancient forest, you're not just removing trees. You're erasing relationships, symbiotic networks between fungi and roots, evolutionary partnerships between plants and pollinators that took millennia to develop. Medieval people didn't understand this. They saw trees as obstacles or resources, nothing more. They didn't know about mycorrhizal networks, the underground fungal webs that connect trees and allow them to share nutrients and chemical signals. They didn't know that old-growth forests store more carbon, support more biodiversity, and regulate water cycles better than young forests. They didn't know that soil isn't just dirt. It's a living ecosystem that takes centuries to build and can be destroyed in a generation. They couldn't have known, but we do. And yet, we're still making the same mistakes. We're still clearing forests at staggering rates, mostly in the tropics now, but the pattern is the same. We're still growing monocultures, vast fields of genetically identical crops that are just as vulnerable to disease and pests as medieval wheat. We're still depleting soil faster than it can regenerate. We're still treating plants as if they're infinite, as if there will always be more, as if nature exists solely for our convenience. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, or maybe helps you sleep, depending on how you look at it. Plants are extraordinarily resilient. They've survived 5 mass extinction events. They've adapted to ice ages and hothouse climates. They've colonized every continent except Antarctica. And even there, a few hardy species cling to life. They've evolved defenses against herbivores, pathogens, and environmental stress that are so sophisticated we're still discovering them. Plants don't give up easily. The weeds we talked about, the dandelions and nettles and thistles, they're proof of that resilience. They didn't thrive because medieval Europe was a paradise. They thrived because it was a disaster. They found opportunities in disturbance, in broken ground, in spaces where nothing else could survive. And they're still here, still spreading, still adapting. Life doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It works with what it has. There's something oddly comforting about that. No matter how badly we damage ecosystems, no matter how many species we drive to extinction, life persists, not the same life. Not the complex, diverse, beautiful ecosystems we started with, but something. Weeds, generalists, survivors. Nature has a way of filling empty spaces, even if what fills them isn't what we'd choose. But we shouldn't settle for weeds. We shouldn't accept degraded ecosystems as the new normal. Because we have something medieval people didn't have, we have knowledge. We understand how ecosystems work, how plants interact with soil, how biodiversity creates resilience, how forests regulate climate. We have the tools to restore what's been lost. Reforestation projects are bringing back native forests. Regenerative agriculture is rebuilding soil health. Conservation efforts are protecting endangered species. It's not too late. It's never too late as long as there are plants still growing. And on a more personal level, on the level that matters when you're lying in bed trying to quiet your mind, plants connect us to something larger than ourselves. They're the reason we can breathe. They're the foundation of almost every meal we eat. They regulate the climate, clean the air, and create the landscapes we find beautiful. When you look at a tree, you're looking at a living system that's converting sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into wood, leaves, and oxygen. That's alchemy. That's magic. Even if we can explain it with chemistry. Medieval people saw magic in plants too, but they misunderstood it. They thought the power of a medicinal herb came from God or from astrological influences. They didn't know about alkaloids, terpenes, and glycosides, the chemical compounds plants produce to defend themselves and that we've learned to use as medicines. They didn't know that the reason willow bark reduces pain is because it contains salicylic acid, the compound aspirin is based on. They didn't know that the foxglove's ability to slow a racing heart comes from cardiac glycosides that affect sodium-potassium pumps in heart muscle cells. They just knew it worked, and that was enough. We know more now. We can isolate compounds, synthesize them, understand their mechanisms, but we've lost something too. We've lost the sense of wonder, the direct relationship with plants that comes from harvesting your own herbs, from knowing which tree produces the best firewood, from understanding your local ecosystem because your survival depends on it. Most of us are completely disconnected from the botanical world. We buy vegetables wrapped in plastic. We heat our homes with electricity or gas. We take aspirin without thinking about the willow tree it came from. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that disconnection is the price of progress, of comfort, of not having to work yourself to death just to survive. But maybe we've lost something important too, a sense of reciprocity, a recognition that we're part of nature, not separate from it, that when we damage plants, we damage ourselves. So, as you drift off tonight, I'll leave you with a thought, a challenge maybe. Tomorrow, pay attention to plants. Not just as scenery, but as living things. Notice the trees on your street, the weeds in sidewalk cracks, the vegetables in your kitchen. Think about where they came from, what they need to survive, what role they play in the larger ecosystem. You don't have to become a botanist. You don't have to change your life. Just notice. Just acknowledge that plants exist, that they matter, that we depend on them in ways so fundamental we usually don't even think about it. Because the story of medieval plants isn't just about the past, it's about now. It's about the choices we make every day, about what we consume, what we waste, what we protect, what we destroy. And it's about the future, about what kind of world we'll leave behind. Will we learn from medieval mistakes, or will we repeat them on an even larger scale? Will we treat plants as partners, or as resources to be extracted until there's nothing left? The plants can't answer those questions. They can only grow, adapt, and hope that this time the humans get it right. But we can answer them with our actions, our policies, our daily choices. And maybe, just maybe, we can create a world where plants don't just survive in the margins, but thrive in the center. Where forests are protected, soil is cherished, and biodiversity is recognized not as a luxury, but as a necessity. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through medieval botany, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the hidden stories of science and history. And leave a comment. Tell me what you learned, what surprised you, or what you want to hear about next. Maybe share a thought about your relationship with plants, or a memory of a garden, a forest, a field that mattered to you. And here's your challenge, if you want one. Tomorrow, find one plant, just one. Learn its name, look at it closely. Notice the shape of its leaves, the pattern of its veins, the way it captures light. Think about what it needs to survive, and what it gives back to the world. It doesn't have to be exotic or rare. A dandelion will do. A houseplant? A tree outside your window. Just one plant. Just one moment of attention. Because attention is the beginning of care. And care is the beginning of change. Sleep well, everyone. Dream of forests regrowing, of soil healing, of seeds sprouting in unlikely places. The Middle Ages were dark, but they ended, and every day, somewhere, a plant is growing, reaching toward the light, refusing to give up. We could learn something from that. Good night.